Got it.
Okay, welcome back.
Thanks.
We'll see if they can figure out how to do it in the room.
Didn't pop up before.
There you are.
Didn't get the pop-up initially, but maybe I had to try to turn my mic on and that forced the pop-up. I don't know. It was weird. It just said it was being recorded. And I said, oh, okay.
It's all there. And Carrie's also back with us too. So the meeting being recorded. So we started the meeting with just a call to order and a review of the agenda with no changes being noted. And then we made, we had a motion for a nomination of chair of myself by Carrie and seconded by Rob. And then we had a, which was a unanimous vote, in affirmation. And then we had a nomination by Carrie for Chris as vice chair with a second by myself. And that was vote in the affirmative, unanimous vote in the affirmative. And so we're just reviewing the committee rules of procedure at this point. And so one of the things that was brought up was time limits was one of the things to consider in our draft rules of procedure. Mike, you also made the mention of 3D to review that. And I was making a comment about the NFIP study committee webpage. That's something that we're going to build out. That'll be a kind of a landing page for this committee. So we can post materials. We'll post meeting agendas. We can post any sort of documents that are relevant for public participation and for the committee members to be able to access. It'll also be an area where people will be able to link up to provide RSVPs for participation in public meeting. So, and then we remember to start recording. So that was just a note to that. So that study committee webpage hasn't been built at this point. So we could amend this by saying like once created, the NFIP study committee webpage once created. And then, so we'll use the DEC calendar, which is what we used for this meeting for public posting. One of the things I also mentioned, being an advisory public body, it looks like we have the ability to be fully remote, that we don't always have to be meeting in person or with a person in a designated public space like you sometimes have to be for municipal meetings. And so that's also just something to be aware of. And so if we ever needed to do a fully remote meeting, that having a person in a publicly like designated spot for them to attend in person is not a looks like according to Act 133 is not a requirement for this body like you would for a municipality.
Generally, if these meetings continue to be held on Tuesdays, I'm in the office anyway. So whether I'm in the room alone or if people want to come in here, I mean, this time slot to me is always available for in person for anybody that wants to participate that way. So.
And because all of our future meeting dates are that second Monday.
Yeah, Mondays work too for me. For in person.
This concludes when? The committee concludes when?
Well,
the only thing I'm thinking about is
the
Monday holidays. I think the only Monday holiday is probably Indigenous Peoples Day in autumn, because we're not going into the new year, right? So we're not hitting all the President's Day.
We're hoping to have the committee's work and the legislative report done before the next legislative session. I mean, again, we're behind on the dates, so we're really moving this along as soon as fast as practicable, right?
Yeah. So I scheduled out to the end of December. I scheduled meetings out till December, and you know, I hope that this isn't the case, but to Rob's point, I think we want to try to wrap this up by the end of the calendar year. So if we need a little bit of extra time, if we're doing work on the report or anything like that, then we could maybe add a meeting if, as needed, like a special meeting. But I was trying to aim to have it towards the end, concluded by the new year is our goal. I think everyone's probably, like you said, Chris, like, let's get a move on. Get it done. So two of the things Mike brought up, one of the things I had in here was consideration for like public speaking, for consideration for public comment. The format that I had seen that the regional stormwater committee took a format where they have public comment section at the beginning of the meeting and they have one at the end. And so there's a format where people who signed up through RSVP can comment at the beginning of the meeting, and then an open public comment at the end for people who haven't registered, or a comment of what happened in the meeting. Other bodies can sometimes have less formal public comment where it could be before each agenda item. But given the nature of this committee, I feel like we're not like a city council or like a town select board where you're going through like all these points of business and may have very vastly different topics and like aren't always related to each other. So I was thinking that the format of having like people who register comment at the top of the meeting, people who are just present and may want to provide commenting at the end made more sense because we're focused on one topic and then each meeting kind of being drawn into more of a topic focus. So just open for discussion on that and what kind of time limits we may want to consider for that, if that's the direction we go in.
The question I have is, do we need to have the opportunity for them to provide comment twice? The reason I ask is, I mean, this is a very specialized area we're speaking and considering and coming up with recommendations for. And my preference would be to, we're going to have an agenda, we're going to spend some chunk of time going through that agenda, taking comment at the end based on what the public heard us discuss and contemplate might be the most valuable. I don't know, obviously we can take comment on both sides, but I'm just trying to think how we do this efficiently. So
I guess maybe a question to Carrie, since you're participating in the regional stormwater committee, like, have you found how had those meetings run with that kind of format? Has that been somewhat successful, or have you found issues with it? Has it like not flowed very well if people want to comment on specific things, or any sort of feedback you have?
It's actually worked really well. And we've had some public comment period. Mostly it was driven by some of the members to the committee where they've brought in or at least reflected comments from organizations that they were affiliated with. So that was helpful. But for the most part, it worked well.
We do something similar with Climate Council. I mean, multiple opportunities for public comment. Same thing with nuclear decommissioning, citizens advisory panel. And honestly, with this one, I don't see like it's going to be disruptive. I mean, I think, and even I think just the perception of being open to comment, I think is a good thing, especially given the concerns that people raised around rural issues, land use issues. I think that's being open to more comment than less would be a good thing.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for mentioning that. In the stormwater project, we've also had some members of the public who have where the topic at hand was affecting them personally, and so it was, instead of waiting for the to speak up at the end of the day, 2 hours later, they were given the opportunity to speak up front. And I think that helped them for their own time management. And then while others were, as I mentioned, in the committee that were representing some parties, they could speak up at the end. And so it just provided more flexibility for the public to participate in the ways that it would best fit their needs.
Yeah, and I
Makes
found
sense.
that like from the feedback I've seen, like for my own community's council, that we've heard people who've had to sit through like 2-hour, 3-hour meetings for their 5-minute comment at the very end, like sitting through all the other things. So I do like the idea of being able to have like more targeted, specific public comment maybe at the top, and then having more of an open public comment at the end. But I think one of the things is trying to, not sure, how many people may participate from the public or not, but trying to keep things reined in on topic is one of the things that I was looking for in adding some more specific guidelines on public participation. So, I think my experience with my municipal DRB is that we do 3 minutes for public comment during hearings. We almost never have anyone who actually shows up for just general public comment in our meetings, so we've never had to exercise that. And so my experience is like 3 minutes, unless, to give everyone the opportunity to comment, and can allow for, if the chair, whoever is the presiding officer, can give additional time to someone who has like more things to talk about, but that would be at the discretion of that presiding officer, like how to run it. So it can allow for formality or more informal type of a setting, depending on if you have like 3 or 4 people sitting there waiting to speak, how to manage time at the committee. So I've been used to 3 minutes. If you wanted to think of something as a longer time, because this is kind of a specialized topic that we want to allow 5 minutes for public comment, or different time frames for different parts of the meeting, I'm open to any input or thoughts people might have.
Yeah, we usually did 3 to 5 minutes on ours. That tended to work. I mean, I think for me, the most important thing is just to make sure that public comment is put in at the beginning and the end, and it's not in the
middle.
in our work. That's my concern, because as I said, we've got a person who, if he decides he wants to be interested, he's going to want to interject on every item. He was going to want to question our guests. He's going to want to be basically a de facto member of the board, because he's a member of the public and he should be allowed to speak because it's his right to speak. And if we don't have the rules that say you have a right to speak at the start, you have the right to speak at the end, you don't get to speak for basically at the end. Our council meetings shortened by 30 to 45 minutes. Because we used to have it, you can comment on every agenda item. And he did. He took his 3 minutes on every agenda item throughout the entire night. And we were able to shorten the meetings by about 30 to 45 minutes by saying you can only talk at the start and you can only talk at the end, and in the middle you can't talk unless it's a public hearing. And I mean, we hate to have to do that, but we have to make rules for the exceptions, or they will explicitly say, well, the rules don't say I can't, so I can't.
Yeah.
And hopefully that doesn't become a thing, but we could just enjoy and have our conversations and be able to work effectively.
But we should be prepared.
We should be prepared for the outliers, and they probably wouldn't have shown up except that I'm on the committee. So that's why I point out that he tends to follow me around.
No, it's good to be aware of. I don't feel strongly one way or the other, whether it's 3 or 5. I do like the bookend idea with no opportunity in the middle of the meeting.
I guess I'd suggest 3, and then we can always have some flexibility if there's nobody else.
I like that as well. I was going to suggest the same thing, because we have the ability to allow for extra time as long as it's kind of granted at that point. So it helps to keep it on topic is kind of the I guess is the next point that you brought up. So I put in 3 minutes here. I'm going to take this out. I was just trying to draw attention to that one item. So 3 minutes for public comments. I guess, how long is the public comments section at the beginning of each meeting for folks who sign in? 3 minutes. So we probably want like 5 or 10 minutes as a whole section in our agenda. Each person speaks for 3 minutes. So I'm thinking maybe like 5 minutes at the beginning 5 minutes at the end. That would be like a time, or 10 minutes that would allow for people to speak. Like like your agenda time frame.
Oh, I think what we were referring to is 3 minutes for a speaker,
Per speaker.
person.
Per person,
Yeah.
They would, each
Yeah.
speaker would get 3 minutes.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what I have here. I have no member of the public may speak for longer than 3 minutes without the consent of the presiding officer. For here, I laid out like how much time essentially in our agenda do we leave for public comment.
I think
And
starting
so,
off with 10 makes sense. I mean, and then we'll
Okay.
just adjust accordingly.
I think it's like a mechanism of how to manage timing. Like if you're do you extend more time to someone to speak again if you're maxed your 10 minutes out on public comment from other people, like everyone getting a chance to speak. So it helps to give some bounds to like how much time is available. And obviously we can extend that time if we had more people sign up who wanted to provide more, longer testimony. So I put 10 minutes for public comment at the beginning and at the end. We could keep it shorter to 5 minutes.
I think 10 minutes is a good placeholder.
Yep.
Okay,
And
we
if
could always
we only
change
have
it.
one person show up, then it'll only be 3 minutes long. And if we've got
Yeah.
whatever.
Yep. Okay. So one of the other things, Mike, that you made note of was 3D, which is this next item here. Members of the public will be afforded a reasonable opportunity to express their opinions about matters considered by the body, so long as order is maintained according to these rules. And so I think there was something that you wanted to discuss here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in after a reasonable opportunity, I wanted to add in during public comment. I didn't want somebody to kind of go through and say, well, it says in D, I'm allowed to express my opinions, even though it's in the middle of the meeting. It's members of the public will be afforded a reasonable opportunity during public comment to express their opinions about matters.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. And one of the things I was going to put in here, and I separated it out as a separate point. I'm sure for like Chris and for Mike, you probably recognize this is from the VLCT model for rules of procedure. I took a lot of these points from, but I have a specific thing here. Public comment must be germane to an item on the agenda. So again, like trying to focus. So one of the considerations, members of the public will be afforded a reasonable opportunity during public comment or to express their opinions and concerns, their opinions during public comment about matters considered by the body, so long as order is maintained according to these rules. We could also put that in that the topic relates to the work of the committee or the work of the body, if we wanted to emphasize that. About matters considered by the body and are relevant and are related.
Unless you're deleting H, I don't know if that's necessary.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Good. Okay.
During public comment, that's key sideboard there.
And I thought the rest of it was fine.
Okay. And so for something like this, which is like a rules of procedure, just because it's a little bit more of like us adopting this, just to double check and make sure we're all in consensus on these rules of procedure as they stand. Do you want a formal motion?
Yeah, I'll make the motion to approve the rules of procedure.
Second.
Great, thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, these are adopted then.
So I wanted to note you, in your agenda you had earlier under B, you had a little aye for nomination elections. You also had an aye for motion to ratify any actions or decisions made in a prior meeting. Was that one that overlooked? Is there something we have to ratify or are we fine?
That is a great question, Mike. And that was one of the things I was going to mention next. In speaking with our legal team, because of the gray area of like a legislative advisory body, I think they kind of were recommending at first to be on the like ultra conservative side, is to ratify any decisions or actions taken by the board in the first two meetings. And in speaking with them further, they're like, I think that that's kind of like overkill because no decisions by this board, by this body have been made. And so recommended that we didn't really need to have that. I mean, we could if that was something that made the rest of the group feel more, feel better about it. The one thing they thought is by sharing the meeting minutes from the first two meetings as part of this agenda and part of the public notice, kind of address those concerns, which summarize the work and discussion that was done, since we haven't actually made any decisions as a committee and haven't really taken any actions essentially at this point. So it seemed like it was kind of overkill and said that it wasn't something that was truly needed. But we can do that if people would like to consideration for that.
I'm good with not ratifying. I mean, it's tough to ratify an action if we don't actually have any action to point to say that's what has to get ratified. So,
Yep. Good question. Good pickup. So next on the agenda, we talked about it a little bit, but discussed, and I put a motion to again, like these are just like business of the board. So I think it doesn't have to be formal, but we can do these as formal motions. Just to ratify some of these things, which is the decision of future meeting dates and times. As we discussed just a few minutes ago, second Monday of each month, except for October, where we set the meeting date and time for October 5th. And so just confirming those dates, and if there is ever a date to be rescheduled, we can review the following month's meeting, at the end of our agendas too, just to confirm that that still works for everyone. Because life happens, things happen. And so if it doesn't look like we're going to have a quorum for the next month's meeting, we could always then reschedule it at this meeting or prior to warning for the next meeting. And then this is where I was going to bring up that topic, Mike, that you mentioned, which was review and affirm the meeting minutes from previous meetings. And so that was kind of the recommendation from council. Again, they're not representing our committee, but their recommendation is that you could just kind of affirm the discussion and anything that was done in them, but we don't necessarily need to ratify anything since it doesn't seem like we've done any business that would require actually ratifying in a formal way. So I think that folks have reviewed the meeting 1 and meeting 2 minutes. I attached them on the email. So our kickoff meeting was December 16th, 2024. And then had a follow-up meeting was.
And we don't need to from my perspective, do we need to actually vote on affirmation or can we just say?
Yeah, look good.
Affirmed? I mean, barring any disagreement of the minutes affirmed.
I think so. I mean, I feel comfortable with that as long as the rest of the group feels comfortable proceeding that way. Because I think in that rules of procedure document that we were reviewing, hi, Catherine. In the rules of procedure document, we have it as a more informal board and can revert back to Robert's rules. And I think maybe if we have very consequential decisions, we can have that affirmation of a motion and a vote. But I think for something with meeting minutes review and affirm them, I think just general consensus. I'm comfortable with that unless someone does
That's
not.
what we do in private council if it works.
Okay.
So in other words, the vote will be to accept the minutes.
I wasn't necessarily going to do a formal vote. And I think that's what I
I
took your comment to be, Chris, is not doing formal motions and votes for something like that, unless people brought up issues, or we can have more formal, I think as a group, if we believe that we want to be more formal, accepting the meeting minutes from previous meetings. That's for discussion.
Yeah, so usually the way this would work, Carrie, is you'd have somebody, the chair would just go through and say, unless I hear any objections, I will consider the meeting minutes of December 16th and February 19th to be approved. Hearing no objections, I deem them approved.
That's great.
That's usually the
that's-
process and how it works.
Yeah, and that's aligned with Robert's rules too.
Okay. Well, unless I hear any objections. I'll move that the meeting minutes from December 16th, 2024 and from February 19th, 2026 are hereby approved.
Have my positive affirmation.
There you go. Catherine, welcome. We went through our rules of procedure documents. So one of the, just maybe real quickly, just so that you're caught up, and we'll send this out after the meeting. Like, let me make sure I did not close them out. I probably did. I X'd them out. In the rules of procedure document, we reviewed that together as a committee. We spoke a little bit about public comment and the way that the public comment process would work. We decided on 10 minutes at the start of the meeting and 10 minutes at the end of the meeting to allow for public comment as it describes in the rules of procedure, and allowing 3 minutes per speaker to speak unless additional time is afforded to them by the presiding officer. We also had a motion at the start of the meeting for an affirmation of me as chair and Chris as vice chair. So we've done that. And we spoke a little bit about open meeting rules. In short, basically the attorneys are like, it's kind of a gray area with like legislative committees, but if we just consider ourselves to be an advisory public body, we don't run by the same rules as like a municipality would for their city council or select board. But that we can hold fully remote meetings. We don't have to have a person in a physical location for the meetings. And we, in the rules of procedure, talk about like noticing for public meeting and stuff. So we'll send out the finalized adopted rules of procedure following this meeting. And they'll be posted. The other thing I mentioned is that we have in the rules of procedure a mention of a legislative committee website. So Tessa and I have been talking about that before our last meeting. And so it's not built at this point, but it'll be like a page online where we'll share it. We'll post notice on the DEC calendar and on that site. And that site will also be like a repository for recordings and for meeting minutes and any sort of documents.
You've been busy. Congratulations as chair and vice chair.
We're like, well, we're ready for this agenda. We're ready for it. So with that, we'll go to the second item on the agenda, which is the review committee charge and discussion. So this was brought up, I think, in past meetings with a discussion around what is our charge, what are we looking at, kind of what is the breadth of the things that we're considering, because it feels sometimes hard to focus in on the charge of this committee, given the flux, I feel like, in the public domain of everything surrounding FEMA and relating to the National Flood Insurance Program, relating to what are we tasked specifically with, you know, what is the breadth of all the different things to think of. So one of the things that I attached in the meeting invite was the language from Act 121. I have to actually find it in my, here we go. Here, I'll share it. Here we go. So, I don't want to make it too small so no one can read it. So this is just taken right from the Flood Safety Act language, Section 10. and it's pretty succinct. I think in previous conversation, I've kind of looked at these first 3 points, and I can turn off my, these first 3 points as kind of the charge, and then from this is kind of the recommendations. So summarizing existing responsibilities of individual municipalities, assess the ability of municipalities enrolled in the NFIP to comply with the minimum standards, and identify specific barriers. Assess the feasibility of DEC Rivers to take on the administrative burden of the NFIP, including an assessment of the various scales with which this would occur. 4 is estimate staffing needs to do so to effectively administer the NFIP on behalf of Vermont's municipalities. Recommend how to phase in proposed state-administered NFIP program. And propose to the General Assembly funding sources to support all potential administrative costs for a proposed state-administered NFIP, including permanent full-time classified staff in DEC Rivers program, needed to establish a flood hazard area permitting program and permitting fee for applications. So this document shows the charge of the committee being very focused on like DEC playing this role of taking on the administrative burden of the NFIP on behalf of Vermont municipalities.
Rebecca,
I think-
where's the standardized state flood hazard bylaw shell, or is that in this?
Sorry, say again?
The standardized flood hazard bylaw model, or
That
in
is
this?
also, it's also in the Flood Safety Act, but it's not part of this committee's consideration. So that is a separate section that precedes section 10. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly which section it is, but it precedes section 10. But I think that that's part of the discussion that you brought up in the past, Chris, and the discussion of the committee has been kind of those limitations, standardized, you made the point, Chris, in the past, like standardized municipal bylaws doesn't necessarily mean that they are complying with the programs, that they're actually doing compliance, to comply with the program's minimum standards. So like having minimally compliant standards or even a state higher standard for communities doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to do the work that's required of them for the NFIP. So from this charge, that's part of, I think, from listening to what people brought up and thoughts that Rob and I have had just in past consideration, is kind of the list of potential future topics to explore. So I just wanted to frame this and have this for conversation as a group before we jump into the idea of like, what will our future meeting topics be? Who might we invite in to speak and lend their perspective or expertise to the committee?
The number one in the list, that must already exist somewhere in some form.
Yes, I mean, I think that the minimum NFIP responsibilities is something that we do, that our office does, basically in working with FEMA. I don't know if you want me to like state it here, but I think that's a pretty easy one. It's basically like issue permits for development in your floodplain in accordance with the bylaws that you've adopted, and that the bylaws you've adopted are minimally compliant, and that you enforce. And that's one of the points Chris has made in the past. So, and you're enforcing them. That's a big piece of it.
And I think number 2 could be pretty simple if we can get 2 things. One is, I think even if it's not like, I don't think it needs to be like quantitative or scaled or anything, but if you guys are able to provide some kind of summary based on, I forget if they're called community visits or what they are, like when FEMA comes, or when there's the audits of the
Community assistance visits.
Yeah.
CAVs.
If you could just provide us like a summary of like choose whatever the time frame is, but just kind of what's been the finding, is there, what, because to me, that would be incredibly helpful, because that's actually that's actually reviewing for compliance with the NFIP. And so I think that could be done, I would hope, fairly quickly. The other thing and we're talking about like bringing in guest speakers and others, one of the things that as I've always struggled with the Vermont concept, and this is just based on having been the person in charge of this for a county in Maryland, is that comply with the program's minimum standards. And I just struggle with, and I've talked about this before, I'm not trying to open up a can of worms, but in terms of like the basic standards, how do you do this without building code requirements and permit requirements? So I'm thinking specifically towns without zoning, because right, if you're supposed to be tracking like improvements to the value of a property, I don't know how you do that. Because that's a fundamental minimum standard. I'm not trying to open up a can of worms, but part of the answer of this is,
Yeah.
it's really hard in the absence of some of these other things. And it's not saying to the legislature it can't be done. It's just a foundational, this is the reality
Yeah.
of it.
I mean, I think looking at 1 and 2, I envisioned, at least in terms of the legislative report drafting, that Rebecca and I could probably do 90% of the initial drafting of that and then backfill it with your input, perspective, experience. I mean, we have our experience through the flood insurance program coordination, but then as you just described, Chris, through your lived experience administering bylaws in Barry and Montpelier, we could really then further build out that narrative of why NFIP is not structured well for rural New England.
And this doesn't have to be a tone, right? I mean,
No. We want to get to the brass tacks ultimately of, hey, legislature, this is what we're recommending and why. But so 1 and 2, I feel like is the easier part of this overall effort. It gets thorny quickly when we move on from that. But go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think that what Rob said, yeah, we can provide some background information. I think your point, Chris, about kind of some of the summarizing CAVs and CACs, community assistance visits, which are more like formal, and community assistance contacts. We count that as our development reviews for FEMA. They're changing that whole process on us right now. We can provide a summary of what we have documented. So our community assistance visits, the more intensive interactions that are more like outside of specifically proposed development, we do 2 or 3 of those a year, usually trying to vary geography and location and kind of where we know there might be issues. Either we know a town is having compliance issues and choosing whether or not, they're going to enforce something, or it could be a town that's in the community rating system. So trying to document that they've got their stuff together. Just trying to show, like for Montpelier, for example, as a CRS community, they're doing what they need to do, and it's an opportunity. Or it could be a town that's like, we don't know what we're doing. Welcome, this is the National Flood Insurance Program. Let us introduce you to this program that you're a part of. I think that your point about building codes is a really interesting one. And I think it can, especially with Mike being on the committee, your experience in a city that does enforce its own building code. You're not enforcing like flood codes, like ASCE 2424. That's like the actual like flood specific codes in the building code, but you do enforce your codes locally, which is not that's probably like, what are you, like one of 10 municipalities, maybe 10, 12 municipalities that does so. And so I think there's kind of all in between. The building code piece is a real one in terms of understanding what is happening in existing buildings and how it's being done. A lot of our towns and a lot of our model bylaw language really relies a lot on some sort of professional to certify those, to give the town some level of something to fall back on, like this person's electrician or this person's like PE who designed this has certified that, and that gives them the backup, versus like in a town or municipality that has building codes where you have inspectors who are qualified to be able to inspect the work of other people to say this has been done according to the code as it, or whatever the permit may have said. So I think that it's like I think what I see a lot with a lot of these conversations, it's like very scaled because you have towns that are like 500 people and you have towns that are 20, 30,000, or there's not many of those, but towns that are 10,000 people. But there's a lot in between those two extremes. And so
And I
it's
think
like,
that gets to the barriers is they
Yeah.
might be different for different municipalities and also the municipalities without any zoning or ordinances at all that and how to address those communities and what those barriers are. It's probably just an anecdotal summary, but I do think that's a piece that we need to make sure we tackle when we're looking at the town by town versus the statewide approach.
oh, go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, thank you. I can't imagine Vermont being unique in these struggles to implement and enforce the NFIP program at the municipal level, especially for those more rural towns in other states. And I imagine you've evaluated or have been aware of other state approaches to address some of these barriers, such as portions of the NFIP program that could be administered at the federal level with perhaps a little administrative burden. So I raise that because I think having that information about the struggles of other states in confronting this very issue will be informative in terms of understanding what other options or what options could be we could consider.
And I think both of those, I think Catherine and Carrie, both great points. I think, Catherine, one of the things, not to go too far forward in looking at topics and who we might invite, but actually NRPC, I feel like you've taken a kind of unique approach, and maybe it's not unique. And so Chris or others can push back, but how you have kind of like a zoning administrator housed in your shop to help provide support to some of the towns that have historically really struggled to staff a ZA, or like just the churn that I'm sure we're all really familiar with is like the churn of small towns. You have like Montpelier, and like Mike, you've been there. And even though Meredith is new, like Meredith is not that new. Like you've had stable staffing. You have Nicholas there. It's like you have some communities that have some real stability where they have paid professional staff, but a lot of our towns really struggle. Even if they have zoning, they struggle with the caseload, the volume, and the technical knowledge that's needed for this program. And so I think one of the things that's, I think, an interesting experience to share is what you found with at NRPC by having that person in your shop. I feel like in the past, over the past 20 something years, as we've talked about different challenges, how could we face some of these challenges that a lot of these small municipalities have? There's the discussion of like more county or regional coverage, or support, or kind of town sharing of positions, like having a more technical person who can be really highly trained and trying to avoid some of that churn. But I agree that towns that don't have zoning, this program is a huge challenge. And that we, along with the RPCs, are doing basically 99% of the process for them. And I think that's part of the intention of our why our office was probably created. Like the role of our office was probably created to help provide that one person who has technical experience to support the towns that are having trouble. The other thing, the other thing I was going to mention to your point, Carrie, about other states and their experiences, again, not to jump too far ahead, and we can talk a little more about it, but the list of states that do have some level of state run or state permitting, that might help to give some insight. We could think about other people we might want to invite, but like Kentucky is a state that I have had some conversation with my counterpart in their state. And I think that's kind of a little bit of like what we're discussing for rural communities, is a little bit of why they have a state permit. And then you have the flip side of that, which is New Jersey, which New Jersey has like they just adopted their new state permit, like very high standards, like way exceeding anything that the NFIP has, and is also in a lot of cases much more redundant because New Jersey is a state that has building codes and a lot more formal zoning and planning mechanisms in place. So,
Can I ask a clarifying question on, I'm just not remembering from act, from when we were working on the act, where it says identifying the specific barriers to enrollment and compliance. So compliance tells me that's the town complying, not necessarily the insurance holders, the policy holders.
You're right.
Enrollment sounds like insurance enrollment, or is that, or is that supposed to mean towns participating?
I take it to mean towns
Okay,
participating and enrolling in the NFIP.
okay.
I agree. That's what my take on it is. We actually have a pretty good, except for states that have like mandatory enrollment essentially, because they might have like a state role in it or that they require their towns to be in the NFIP. We have pretty good participate. We have like 92% of our communities are in the NFIP. So that's pretty good. Some states in the Midwest and the West are like not even close to that. Like not even close. But I think it's important to note and to address is like, what is the barrier to a town joining and why would a town not join? And I think it's the same as like what you brought up, Catherine, which is just how to participate in the program. Like that means we have to have zoning regulations that, you know, because even though they may just have flood regulations, that is a zoning. So now we have to have all the formality around that. We have to know how to form a board. We have to know how to hold a hearing. We have to know how to issue a permit. We have to have someone who does this, like as a administrator, which is a big lift. So I think one of, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I have a thought on 3, if we, or do we want to stay on 2 for a minute? Or okay, on 3, to me, part of the feasibility question, and I'm kind of, I guess there's a larger question here, which is probably summarized in a half paragraph, which is what's in it for the state as a whole? If the state as a whole is participating in the NFIP, like are there other benefits, like funding benefits from FEMA or other entities? And then there was a question I brought up last time about the private insurance realm. And I saw where, I saw it last night on LinkedIn where Hardwick had brought in the state commissioner for insurance to talk about flood insurance. And I thought that might be a good person to talk to
For sure.
and get their perspective on the whole gamut, right? And I'm sure they've been, you know, nationally are aware of what's been going on in the private and public realm. In my own life, I haven't started looking at, I am going to look at other private insurance, non-NFIP backed flood insurance for our property, but I've just been really curious about what I've been reading about. Like I said, mentioned it last time, but just for the record, you know, potentially higher levels of coverage, because right, you're capped at 250.
Yeah.
And so even a lot of mortgages these days are not even going to be, are going to be above the 250. But, and then I'm right, the home contents, I think it's capped, was 100,000 or 150,000.
I don't know what the contents is these days, Rebecca, do you?
Not off the top of my head.
But somewhere, something like that.
Yeah.
But then if you can actually get more for less, what does it take the towns off the hook? If, I mean, I guess, because I'm thinking more, the dynamics have kind of changed from relative to when we were first talking about this with the passage of the Flood Safety Act. I'm just curious where we're going. And we may not know where we're going for this report, right? But it does seem like it would be good to kind of have a paragraph in there of like the state of private insurance relative to the state of NFIP backed insurance, and what are the pros and cons of, like, if the municipalities aren't participating, if the state kind of doesn't have an NFIP program, does the private sector sufficiently meet the requirements? Now, because I had assumed they do not.
Yeah.
And maybe they do, and I don't know. So that to me, that's just a logical question to kind of, and if you guys already know the answer to all this, by all means, jump in, but I'm just trying to figure out to what extent are we putting towns through this when maybe we don't have to be. Or, and for the private insurers too, I think one of the questions that I have, I mean, there are a lot of other caveats, because I would imagine, I mean, I'm just thinking of, like, what do you call the people who do the actuarial table type folk? Does that apply to property insurance, or is that just life insurance? Anyway, like if communities don't have building codes, if communities aren't participating in NFIP and don't have flood hazard bylaws, how does that affect the private insurance? Because I would imagine the private insurers are looking for things to be built to a certain standard. So they may still, if the rates may be cheaper, if you're in a participating town or not. So anyway, to me, there's just a lot of questions that feed into this whole assess the feasibility. And in the report, and even the inquiry can probably be fairly succinct, but it just seems like a question worth asking.
For sure. Well, and it's tough because, he talks about the feasibility of us the state taking this on. And so that lends itself, assuming the NFIP continues to exist as it had, there's a dozen questions for FEMA. We think we'll get to that later in the agenda in terms of invited guests, but there's a lot of questions for FEMA, assuming the NFIP continues as is. And then there's a whole nother set of questions of what does this look like, to your point, Chris, if the NFIP dissolves or substantially contracts. And so, yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Well, or is it already contracting, I guess is.
Yeah. Because of other pressures.
Well, because of just the caps on what an FIP covers.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent is it worth the $1,800 a year I'm paying in zone X for $250 worth of coverage? Am I going to be able to get more? And then what are the, and so maybe the Commissioner of Insurance will have insight into, or we could ask, and they could have staff look into how do the private insurers look at the NFIP, and what's the basis for their rates in different places? And I know that does not get into the life safety stuff, right? Which is a whole other dynamic here about trying to get people to build safer in floodplains or avoid them in the first place, bringing buildings to be safer. I mean, I'm talking just on the insurance side, but that's a whole other side of this.
Yeah, I think that just high level, not to go too far down that road, and I think we can very easily invite those folks to join us. We've been working more closely with DFR in the past several months. We're preparing, we're about to release end of August, right, Tessa? End of August. We're going to release our mitigation guide. So it's like a homeowner's guide for steps they can do for mitigation that ranges from like get flood insurance all the way up to like a river corridor easement or floodplain restoration. So it's kind of like this broad set of things that homeowners can consider for mitigation. So we've been working closely with them as we've been preparing the insurance one. I mean, I think the TLDR, like the summary of it, the short summary is basically they don't know that much about what private insurance offerings are. There's no requirement for them to be reported on, but they do have some information that they gathered post 23 and 24 flooding about numbers of coverage, but some of that I think has changed. And I think high level, we talked about the biggest contrast with the NFIP and private insurance is the fact that private insurance can choose who they want to insure and where they want to insure people and for how much. And so that's you're kind of at the whim of the market, but they can speak much more intelligently about the experiences in Florida where you had entire private insurance go under. Basically, they didn't spread their losses or reinsure enough, and then you have catastrophic storms like, was it Maria that came through, or Milton that came through, and Helene and stuff, and then all of a sudden went bankrupt.
And that's great if we could also get examples of other mountain state, right? Like what's been the impact in, right? Because coastal areas, just the scale is so vast, and the valuation of the properties is so huge. It's just, that's a different dynamic than say a North Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, a Colorado, or, a Washington State, or Vermont, New Hampshire. I mean, there may not be, we may not know, but
Yeah, but not knowing is still some level of data. We might not know because there's no information for people to be able to know, which is its own information. Yeah, I think that that's a really good idea. I wouldn't want to, as a committee, focus too much on the insurance market piece of it. But I do think it's relevant in terms of like the question you raised, Chris or Mike. Like one of the two of you had raised the question of like, what does the state get for towns enrolling? Like with all the towns being enrolled, like what do the towns get for enrollment? Kind of what are the considerations for why towns enroll in the NFIP? What are the benefits? Like, does the
Well,
benefits outweigh the negatives?
well, and I always kind of collapse back down to it's the mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement that attaches
Yeah.
to federally backed mortgages in FEMA mapped flood hazard areas, right? That is the reason, because I think there's some towns that absent that, they'd love to not have that, the burden of having to issue permits.
Well, it's that, and it's, I think, FEMA's tried to sweeten the pot a little bit more by having also mitigation grants, access to mitigation grants, and kind of more favorable post-flood PA rates for like structures and buildings and like public buildings in the floodplain. So I think there are those benefits. I think what's the hard part is like we're in the middle of this huge flux, which nothing may change or everything changes, so it's like, how do those benefits confer and like, are they worth it? And, towns that may want to be competitive for mitigation grants because they're in the NFIP still have to do the hazard mitigation plan, and they still have to go through that process. And as I'm sure Chris and Catherine can speak to, that money is not as available as it used to be to do that work.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge to consider the potential for changes or the potential for no changes. And I think we
Right.
just have to move forward with, we know what we know and just accept where we're at. And if
Yep.
anything changes before we release the final report, then we'll pivot at that time. But we just, I think, need to base it on the reality that we know exists right now. But I do think that that uncertainty does feed into some of the barriers about enrollment and compliance. I am curious what people think the final phrase of number 3 means, an assessment of the various scales with which this could occur.
Yeah, that's a great, that's a great question. Rebecca and I have kind of bandied a few things about, like, does the state maybe regulate certain types of development, larger scale development, or more complex proposals in floodways? Not everything. We're not regulating sheds, but those more complicated. And the other thing, it's not really in here as written because it's all about some level of DEC doing this, but do we contemplate and recommend consideration of like a county level structure? I mean, Carrie asked the question earlier about other municipalities being challenged and rural municipalities. And to be sure, all scales of municipality around the country have been challenged administering the NFIP for different reasons. Like Baton Rouge, Louisiana failed significantly to administer their substantial damage provisions after.
Oh, yeah.
That wasn't because they didn't have the professional staff, they just didn't have the political will.
Right.
But when thinking about rural towns, outside of New England, most rural towns are in these unincorporated areas within the county. You have the county government structure and the professionals that the county government has to administer the bylaws. So I just open that up, thinking about scales for us as a DEC. Yes, that's what we've been told to evaluate, but do we also consider potentially recommending something else like a county government or a regional body? I don't know what you would call it. I don't like the term flood control district like it's used out west, but either way you slice it, it all requires some level of funding for professional staff, right? Whether it's at the state level or somewhere else.
And that is something that RPCs could be authorized to do.
Yeah.
And it'd be paid for by permit fees. And
Yeah.
I mean, it could just be something, but I'm not saying we want it. I'm just saying that
Sure.
that we've already got the structures in place, I think, And it could be a kind of an opt-out, opt-in thing
Yeah.
for towns, right? Because Montpelier wouldn't want Central Vermont RPC to take over their work.
Yeah.
But Northfield very well might, you know.
Sure.
And I would also offer, I think in there too, that it specifies us as the state entity. But I think that there's other consideration for other state entities to maybe play a role as well. Like we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, like Montpelier, that has its own, I'm not saying like the Montpelier inspectors, but like the state also has, not many, but we do have some inspectors for public buildings and for fire safety. Like, does that play a role? And I think I mentioned before that Vermont Emergency Management had prepared a planning grant proposal under BRIC, that's Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities. That's like FEMA's current version of PDM, pre-disaster mitigation, which Carrie, I think you'd probably be more familiar with. And they had put in a proposal to look at the role of building codes and having like flood building codes, and that got lost in the whole cancellation of BRIC 24 and 25. So and now FEMA's not funding planning grants under BRIC right now. That's all currently paused under the current fund. I think they're going to put out the call for fiscal year 26 BRIC, somewhat soonish, but we don't know what's going to be in that, where they're going to fund. So I would also propose maybe having that as part of the consideration too, is like, is there a role for other areas of the state that might have capacity or training that could do, to your point, Chris, there's kind of like what is the policy around how and where buildings go, and then how do we actually look at the buildings that are being built or changed? Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, maybe this is one step back at a conversation we had seconds ago versus building codes. But there are some states, Maryland comes to mind, that have I'm wearing my role here on this committee is to try to represent smaller communities. But Maryland has the larger cities be kind of that level of government, but the smaller unincorporated areas and smaller towns are part of county government. So there may be also a hybrid of sorts that are already in place in some states that help provide that kind of support for the smaller communities.
Yeah, another kind of scaling thought, there's do we regulate, does the DEC take on more complex project types? Or is the scaling done where DEC, there's some population threshold? If your town has less than 5,000 people or 2,500 people, the state regulates it. And Rebecca, I'm kind of leaning on you here because you might be more keyed into this because my memory is very fuzzy, but I believe like state of Maine has a population threshold related to like needing to have a code enforcement officer. Like, oh, if you got 4,000 or more people, you need to employ a professional code enforcement officer. So do we index or scale this in a way that considers size of municipality? Because, generally smaller the town, the fewer the resources, right?
And I think that those are all good thoughts. I think I don't want to just looking at the agenda, we've kind of like morphed this section into the last part of the agenda about like discussion of like future topics and stuff, and it's all kind of blending in together. So
Well, I feel like,
but just
I
what I want.
Go ahead.
What I
Sure.
wanted to say is that I think having Maine or another state could be from New England could be also helpful for consideration of just like what they do, because New England is kind of the anomaly for the rest of the country. And that's why I think we might have extra special challenges, is because of the fact that we don't have county government in our states. And all of New England is challenged with that. So you have like Rhode Island, which although their population is much bigger than our state, the size of it and the number of municipalities is much smaller. And then you have something like Maine, which is huge, and they do have code enforcement officers and how that rolls. So that I think is a consideration maybe to bring forward. And I think that I don't think that while we have to answer the charge of the committee with DEC's role, I think that we can introduce some of these other ideas And we can talk about that, I think, in the next section of the agenda too. I don't want to
Yeah.
cut off the conversation.
No, I was just gonna say that I think that 3 is really the crux of our effort, right? I mean, there's the front manner description of kind of the current state. We don't get to the 4, 5, and 6 until we have really kind of evaluated what 3 is. So I think 3 does lead into the rest of the agenda in terms of what we want the topics of future meetings to be, who those invited guests are to kind of advise us and educate us on things we may want to consider. So
And doesn't the pending river corridor regulation also potentially help inform number 3? Because if DEC is regulating development of river corridors statewide, it's not delegated to regions or anything else. I mean, there may be some other mechanisms that you guys want to propose, but it would seem like, I mean, the NFIP at least is even better defined than, I don't know, so like that could help inform, it would seem like, the scales, the administrative burden and everything else, because you're already gonna have to do it. And the river corridors in theory are bigger and more than, right, than the MAP flood hazard corridors.
depends on Reach River, but yeah, a lot of cases for sure. Yeah.
And I think that, you know, we can share our experience. Act 250 is kind of like the parallel to that, because that is what we're doing in Act 250 when we comment for district commission cases. You know, we're reviewing each, and for our state rule, which is very limited in scope, but when we look at those projects, we're looking at it through 2 different lenses. You kind of like overlay the river corridor, we overlay the floodplain, and what are the site constraints, and what do those constraints mean for what can go forward? You know, because that it's fun and interesting trying to explain some of that as we're talking to someone who gets very hung up on like the floodplain piece of it. You know, they might get really hung up on the like about like the no rise and like fill in the floodplain, but the whole site's in the river corridor. And what does that mean?
Are you guys looking at Act 250 administrative permits too?
Sorry, say again.
Are y'all looking at like the Act 250 administrative permits and minors and all those too for river corridor?
We should be. Because there's a lot that they determine as minors where it's like, whoa, that's actually significant activity in a river corridor. And so we have our own challenges there.
What I was thinking about,
Messy.
what I was thinking about was, again, as far as feasibility, like scale. So like already, I mean, to me, it'd be helpful if you guys could be as candid as you can possibly be, like, we're already missing this whole universe of development projects and places that we're supposed to be reviewing and offering comments. Now we're looking ahead at permitting in river corridors, and we're looking at, and that can help inform the feasibility of permitting. And I really said NFIP too. To me, it kind of helps you get it cracking both nuts at one time.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
I'm not trying to pull us into the whole river corridor realm.
No,
But
but
to me, they're not separate.
They're not separate, and then it's all kind of mashed under the larger Flood Safety Act body of work, right? I mean, that's, you know, the state minimum standards rule that Rebecca's working on. I mean, that's a big question with that, which is, where does that end up? And do we end up with, you know, this recommendations coming out of this study committee having us needing to further amend statute to not just amend our current rule for river corridors, but also the state jurisdiction for NFIP. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, I guess, suffice to say.
Yeah. And it's like when you think about like what is the minimum standard for all towns in the state that they would be enforcing, you know, versus what is, if we have some conversation with this committee about a role of the state regulating or doing some administrative burden of the NFIP, how does that occur? You know, like how does that play in? If each town has a minimum standard, is that now the state's, like how does different standards play into it? So I think we can share candidly kind of our experience, especially in the Act 250 realm and FARC permit realm. I mean, we could do it, you know, in these meetings, we can do it however makes the most sense in the next meeting. where it makes sense. But I think one of the things that river corridors, I think, does play a part in this, in terms of like what are we looking at and what is an answer, because I mean they were tied together. This committee kind of came out because the idea of us doing everything for all towns in the entire state is really not a feasible answer, and this was, so they're intricately tied together. So I think reviewing how that works is going to be an essential part of the conversation of this group. You want to talk about scale and what's the gap, what fills the gap, like how does our program transition if we're doing some level of much heavier regulatory work versus advisory work and technical assistance work. What fills in some of that gap if we're doing more regulatory work than what's filling the gap of the technical assistance that was provided where we may or may not be as active, in my mind, as part of the conversation. So
Rebecca, may I ask just a basic question?
yeah. Go
Um,
ahead.
we a few years ago, after, as you know, the state being pummeled by flooding in various parts of the state, we did move towards having regional floodplain managers around the state, as well as being able to support river corridor mapping, technical assistance, and higher and model standards to support communities wishing to provide more protection in their communities about both the inundation and erosion hazards. And so my question is that obviously there's always a lot of work to be to be done in, but when we have a requirement of NFIP compliance for communities that have adopted higher standards, and a requirement to ask for technical assistance and review at the state level, should any development proposals come forward that are in the special flood hazard area. If we were to try to move in the direction of more of a state role in some of the administration burdens pertaining to the National Flood Insurance Program, it would be helpful to know whether the existing structure we have, I know that part of the questions were posed by the piece of legislation is the what would be the staffing needs, but be helpful to know whether we have adequate staffing needs today to be able to contemplate a greater role on perhaps some of the higher priority needs, especially for our more rural communities that are struggling with compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program implementation administration.
Yeah, and I think that maybe I'm like, just because we're almost at 2:00 and we're like blowing through our agenda. Yes, we can talk a little bit about that. The Flood Safety Act positions that we were given after the 2024 legislative session has definitely changed some of that calculus, and it's changed the way that our program has set up. Because before it was regional floodplain managers kind of doing all things within the region related to floodplains and river corridors, except for obviously the physical science section who is doing the technical work. But in terms of regulatory and technical advisory work, it was kind of like Sasha covers the kingdom. Sasha does like mitigation grant discussions. She has bylaw discussions, regulatory, technical assistance, and all that. Now we've moved a little bit more to separating some of those roles. So Tessa and Asa work with Ned under the flood map updates and flood bylaw updates. And then we have 4 regulatory staff who are reviewing and providing technical assistance under municipal Act 250, or are actually issuing permits for the FARC permit. And so we can talk a little bit about how that's played out. So it's been about a year and a little bit that we've been staffed up. So I think that's a good kind of like current staffing and the current framework that we work in.
And I think for me, I don't know if others don't agree, then I'll work on this on my own time, but it would be really helpful for me in the context of this feasibility, staffing, and phasing in, questions to really understand where DEC is at in terms of all the other questions you're examining and the other tasks you have under the Flood Safety Act, because they are interrelated in many ways.
Mhm.
Very much so.
And I'm not tuned into all of them, so it would be helpful for me to understand.
I think it'd be appropriate that maybe a future meeting for part of the agenda or for Rebecca and I just to, there's basically 5 buckets of work. This committee be one of those 5 to just brief the rest of the committee out on where we are. Happy to do
It would be
that.
helpful for me, definitely.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like they're burned into my brain. Like which are the sections that we're in, but they all overlap so much, Catherine. It's like, it's a great point. It's like, I mean, if it's like, even I feel like within our own program, there's these distinct tasks that we're working on, but they all kind of blend together, and it's like trying to tease out what goes with what.
And
So I think
maybe
that
it's
can
the, yeah, and maybe it's the geography of Franklin and Grand Isle counties, but to me, I can't understand how you could have an NFIP conversation with and a river corridor conversation separately, because they're
Yeah.
essentially the exact same geography.
Yeah.
But I know
Yeah.
that our region is a bit unique in that, probably unique in that regard.
it's not, I mean, it's not in the grand scheme of things, it's not. We are a little like northwestern Vermont is a little different. I live in Catherine's region. So NRPC region is unique, but it's not that much of an anomaly, is maybe a better way to say it. So it's like every site that our regional river corridor and floodplain managers go to a site visit, it's like you're looking through all these different lenses and trying to distill this down on a site to talk about like what's going on here and what's kind of the greatest site constraint or the greatest consideration to lead with. And sometimes that's not always clear. We've worked through a current enforcement case so that, it's current, so I can't speak about it, but it's like, that's been really challenging because you have these competing challenges of river corridor compliance with NFIP compliance, and they work together, but trying to address like which leads and how we move forward with a resolution can be really difficult, of like how to convey that to people. So
Yeah.
we can speak about that.
The other piece where I think looking at the river corridor, opportunities, burdens, challenges, kind of helpfully ties into this is, already we've talked a lot about the NFIP. There's a carrot there, right? And that there's a federal program
Mhm.
that exists to ensure that people have access to flood insurance. And to your point, like if it's a federally backed loan, you're going to have it. Therefore, your town is going to have to participate. And whereas river corridor is purely life safety, the carrot there is it's a double-edged sword. It's that we're trying to protect life and safety in these river corridors, not create hazards downstream and not create undue hazards for the people who are building, even though they of course may not see it that way. But to me, it helps kind of bring the whole life safety piece back into why the NFIP in the first place, and the economic aspects of it, right? As far as like people not putting their life investment into something that is a significant risk of being destroyed, and therefore reducing their wealth or putting them into bankruptcy or what have you. So, and then the NFIP is unless I always question myself this because staff always question me when I bring it up. It's my understanding that is flood insurance is the only coverage you're going to have if your home washes away. That is flood caused, and therefore you have to have flood insurance in order to have recourse. That's the only thing that's gonna cover you. Therefore, if you live in an area where, and that's actually like for my house, my risk is not so much inundation flooding, it's fluvial erosion. That's why I have flood insurance. And so to me, there's that nexus too, right? To make flood insurance available, whether it's public or private, for people who live in river corridors, so that even if you're in Reedsboro and you're perched 100 feet above the Deerfield River, if your house goes, at least you can get access. You can have flood insurance because that's the only thing that's going to pay off your house when it's gone.
Agree.
I would posit that NFIP is just as much about life safety. It's just on a different views. I feel like we've talked about this within our entire, I mean, you understand that it's life safety, but the carrot and stick for towns tends to be the insurance or the mitigation grants. And because there's like the benefit goes to the individual being able to buy flood insurance. But I think part of it is because as a program, we've tended to look through the lens of no adverse impact with inundation. The idea is that you mentioned the person who sinks their life savings into their house that's now at risk for erosion or inundation, but there's also kind of the flip side of that, of the person who goes in and speculates and builds 100 homes in a floodplain and externalizes that risk to the future owners of those
Exactly.
homes.
Yep.
You know?
Exactly.
And they have no idea, and they didn't really have a choice in where the homes were built or how they were built. They're buying them after the fact and don't necessarily have that knowledge, or causing more risk, to the people who are next door who are already there. Kind of the extreme example of it, like in New Jersey and some of these real coastal areas, you have the tiny little, you kind of see it on the lake a little bit, like Lake Champlain, not quite to the same impact, but in the coastal parts of New Jersey, you have these tiny little bungalows that's been in the family for 100 years, and then next door someone bought the lot and knocked that house down, built $1 million house that's to current standards, but then fills the whole lot, and then the people next door all get flooded, so they're passing their risk to the neighbor, the person who is already there. So there's also that piece of it too, I think.
And that's what got Baton Rouge in trouble, was with the Katrina diaspora. People moved up to Baton Rouge. The places easiest to build were in the floodplains all along those big, slow-moving rivers. They didn't flood frequently, but when they do, and they've had a couple of 1,000-year floods, it was massive damage, and for homes that had just recently been constructed. And so, how do you elevate a brick home built on a slab above? Anyway, so that's part of why Baton Rouge got in trouble. They didn't have the political will, because suddenly they had literally tens of thousands of new homes built in harm's way. So how do you bring all of those into compliance?
Yeah. You don't.
In terms of the charge and the assessing the feasibility, it doesn't explicitly say this here, but I would hope that we examine any potential benefits of the DEC or statewide or another level of administration. Like, one thing we've always thought is, if we had a bigger geography that administered these regs, could there be an opportunity for the community rating system, which Vermont doesn't really take advantage of? And what would be the savings? Can we quantify what the savings to Vermonters might look like if the state were to take it over and be able to do CRS on a statewide basis, for example? So those are the sorts of questions we've historically thought about when we try to think of a bigger geography for the NFIP.
For sure.
It's a great point.
Here it's about $30,000 of premiums savings per point.
Per point.
So
Wow.
we're at 8 right now, so it's 60,000. Doesn't save the city anything, but it saves the policy holders
Right.
grouped together $60,000 a year in premium savings.
Which of course, affordability.
That's a lot.
So it makes a difference. So the one thing, that I had mentioned in other meetings that I know are not one of the 6, so I'm not looking to add anything to the 6, was just, because I talked about the fact that really all this taking over and doing everything really doesn't affect existing. So I wanted to go back to the preamble to the charge, which you have on the front of the agenda, is to reduce and recommend how to reduce vulnerabilities to inundation flooding, including how and what scale to shift the responsibilities of administration to the state. So I think my comment was just, I wanted to make sure that we had in either our preamble or our introduction, the fact that even if we took this over and perfectly administered all of the flood hazard zoning regs, we aren't reducing our vulnerabilities.
We're just not making it worse.
We're just not making it worse.
Yeah.
And I think the public and the legislators don't get that. You get a lot of this, well, we're going to pass a new energy code, and that's going to help us meet our climate goals by reducing. No,
No, right.
it doesn't. You know what's reducing it? Efficiency Vermont in a program that helps people to replace inefficient with efficient. It's the programs that will reduce vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
The regulations will help to keep it from getting worse or slow the progression of getting worse.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure that it's understood that these are all great things, but we could perfectly administer the zone. We, like Montpelier, we did a great job administering. I'll pat ourselves on the back. We did a good job administering our zoning. They go above and beyond.
You
We
did.
required all these things. We had 250 buildings that flooded. 6 of them have been removed.
Still.
If we got a flood of 2023, and these were all compliant, we did not, if we get another flood of 23, we're gonna have 242 buildings that will flood.
That's
Our
the story.
vulnerabilities have not gone away.
That's the story right there.
Our 5 buildings that were built since 1973, none of them flooded because they were all built to flood codes since 1973. So build the flood codes. It's great, but it's the program which don't exist. It's the program that will help us figure out how to reduce our vulnerabilities. I just want to make sure there's at some point in there, yes, we're going to have this conversation. It's very important for us to have, but it's not reducing vulnerabilities. And we should at least make a note of that. So it's recognized that this will be talked about in a different committee at a different time because the state will have to put money into it.
I see
That's
any,
real
Fair
money.
point.
yeah, I see any legislative report we submit as an opportunity to educate our lawmakers. So the degree to which we want to frame that, to your point, I'm happy to do that. I think that makes
Yes.
sense.
But we,
Just a reminder, like, in context, here's what we're considering, here's what this report is. But this is the full picture of risk in Vermont and what this will and will not do.
if the state wants to tackle vulnerability, we need to have a different meeting with a different group of people with a different set of.
And I think at least some members of the public will appreciate that because I know under all the act, like when we were talking about Act 181, but then even since then, you know, from the public, one of the comments I hear most frequently about like compact settlement, yada, 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 is like, wait a minute, why are we continuing to invest in places that flood or fluvial erosion risk or inundation flooding risk? It's like, that is a very good point. And so that's why hopefully we can redouble our efforts to kind of help for like flood adaptation and resilience. But that's, I think, not ignoring that, right? That was we heard a lot of that after the 23 and 24 flooding. It's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Why are we trying to force, because what I would hear is, why are we trying to force people to live in places that are at risk?
Mhm.
It's like, we're not, but we're also, you know, so there's a whole lot of other things that need to go along with this. But to your point, Mike, I think acknowledging that reality will be really beneficial to folks.
Totally.
And a good reminder for folks to forget.
Yeah.
And I mean, I see that as like almost like a central tenet of the report is just pointed out. I feel like our entire program has really struggled with this internally in the discussions of like, in the world, let's just say the NFIP is no more. Like, what is a Vermont floodplain management program? Like a Vermont state policy on floodplain management, or like how do we look at that and how do we partner with other entities to help do exactly what you're saying? So you're partnering these standards, which helps to make future development or current, change development have less flood risk, but it doesn't address any of the outstanding housing stock, of which in Vermont, much of it is like, sorry, I have a fly buzzing around flying into my face. That's, we have so much old housing stock, which is, not to shift gears, but I mean, that's a big challenge in the statewide. I mean, that's housing in Vermont. And so in some ways, I think that kind of framing this in this idea, this helps future development, of which I think it's very much a central discussion across the state. It's like, what does future development and future housing look like, and where do we put it? And what's that kind of like, do we put it in floodplains? Not at all. A little bit, all that. I think that's part of like, how do we look at it going forward, but also acknowledging all of the development that's still at flood risk and has to be paired with a mitigation program.
Thanks for bringing that up again, Mike. I think I agree. It's a good reminder for, yeah, really good reminder.
Yeah, 'cause the public and the press is going to catch up the next time there's a flood, and they're going to say, "What we did all this and nothing, and look at it, we're still getting crashed." It's like, well,
Yes.
And
Gonna be that
it's
way.
like, the reality of how hard it is to do that mitigation work. So VEM has like 105 more structures that they're about to buy out, and the amount of work it takes to do that. And while that's significant for those people in those homes and buildings, but it's like that's a significant amount of money and a significant amount of work to kind of like start to buy down your risk, especially as
Well, and-
risk keeps increasing.
And that is now excluding all those other HMGP projects that were gonna help mitigate flooding in villages and downtowns and protect wastewater plants and all, right? So, because I mean, to Vermont's credit, I guess, right? We're really treating the HMGP program as almost an individual assistance program, helping people get out from under their mortgages. I mean, yeah, there's some co-benefit of floodplain mitigation,
Sure.
but really it's about individual assistance.
Yes.
But now to the exclusion of not funding the dam removals, the culvert and bridge upgrades, the wastewater plant moving and all that stuff. And that was part, I'm just bringing this up because that was a big part of the argument that myself, Lauren Oates and others were advocating for the passage of this. And to your point, Mike, it's like, how do we stop further bleeding? Like we already have some bleeding. How do we make it? Because especially, and now that dynamic has changed even more, especially with under this administration, just changes probably come down the road, regardless of whether it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whoever. The likelihood of not getting that HMGP funding, because Vermont has become so reliant on HMGP funding to fund the buyouts.
So
The flood resilient community funding is gone. And that covers the river corridor stuff and other kind of non-FEMA buyouts. So that universe is changing dramatically. And the first thing that happens, Mike, I'm sure you live this, right? And we heard it too. When you lose your business, you lose your home and it's damaged, like, where's public money to help me with this? And the answer increasingly is going to be, there is nothing.
yeah.
And sorry to get on that soapbox.
Well, I think I just want to make sure, correct for the record, I think the right metaphor or statement from our colleague Kevin Geiger is stop the stabbing.
Yeah.
Just want, so I'm gonna, so Carrie, you have your hand up. We'll go to you and then we'll move on in the agenda because we have updates. I think we can make up a lot of time in our agenda on updates, but we'll have you do the last comment, maybe Carrie, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. And I don't know, these are sensitive points we're talking about because when we build on a piece of real estate, we're not necessarily thinking about the impacts of that kind of development on some future flood event. I know we've gotten better, but the lessons learned is critical. And I don't mean to pick on Montpelier at all, but just using it as an example, when you build on floodplain up above the city, or you just create some more vulnerabilities for if and when the city is faced with a flood of a certain magnitude. And so I know that in the past you've tried to gather stories of lessons learned, but again, putting my hat on for smaller communities, wanting kind of and seeking a maintenance of economic vitality for these small communities. Oftentimes they're in narrow valleys. There may be some opportunities for a greater look at how to serve their river corridors to mitigate future flood events. Those opportunities are real and probably pretty real across the state. And so to the extent to which we can try to help communities learn from those lessons and just to whether, again, I'm not picking on Montpelier, but how do we continually highlight the need for that over time so that we don't have more greater risk facing these smaller communities that are trying to develop, trying to build housing, trying to maintain their vibrancy over time, their economic vitality over time, and yet how do they do that in a manner that they won't have regrets later because it's actually the type of development has actually increased their risk. And so I know we've all heard those stories, but again, there's still some tension. There's a lot of tension out there in smaller communities. And so I wanted to just highlight that as really an important part of this is those lessons learned so that we can constantly remind ourselves when we have that amnesia kicking in that there's we need to be considerate of how to keep those costs of recovery down over time.
I think it's a good point. One of the things, so moving on the agenda, I think it's a good kind of, let's see. Oops, I have too many Word doc. I'm trying to get back to my agenda. Here it is. I have a thing in here, updates and discussion. And I think that we can cover a lot of those really quickly. I can make a mention of them instead of maybe diving a little bit deeper into them. We've had some of that kind of conversation from that portion of the agenda in the section we just talked about. I think, Carrie, one of the things that we can share with this committee is our group using FEMA funding had worked with Two Rivers to do some public meetings and outreach around kind of like not quite lessons learned of flooding, but I think feedback and listening of members of the community of different communities post 23 and 24 floods. So we have two different reports. We have the report that we commissioned using the FEMA funding. And then we also we used some Flood Safety Act money to also look at like the unequal experience based on environmental justice considerations, kind of that unequal play of recovery and flood experience. So we have those two reports. Two Rivers had worked with Seiler Consulting in the kind of the middle Winooski, so in Barre and Montpelier, and then had worked with WSP down in like Ludlow and areas in like Southern Windsor, or Mark, I'm going to call them Southern Windsor Regional Planning Commission forever, in Mark's region an area. So kind of like Ludlow and where else? I'm forgetting, Tessa. I feel like it's like Ludlow, Londonderry, maybe some of those towns.
Brattleboro maybe too.
Yeah. So we can share those reports as just some of the insight and things that they found and feedback from the public. Some of it was trying to get some insight into kind of public perceptions around flooding and what recovery looks like, how it looks different for different people in different places, kind of some of the rural challenges, but it's mostly focused on individuals, not as much on municipalities.
I'm not remembering this at all.
Yeah, I don't remember this one at all. I think it's interesting. If there's any reports, it'd be great to see it. I mean, I will say, I know from personal experience, having been in Barre and Montpelier, one of the biggest differences from an NFIP administration difference is substantial improvement, substantial damage, because lower income areas, your house might be worth $200,000, but in a different area it's worth 500, so 50% damage.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, a much smaller flood event, and you can end up with, look at Barre. How many substantially damaged buildings are there in Barre City? How many substantially damaged buildings in Montpelier? And we had it worse in 2023 than Barre did. Barre had many, many more substantially damaged buildings, primarily because their building stock was valued so much less. Ours were valued so much higher that we just did not trigger. We had ended up down to 16 buildings, and 9 of them ended up close to substantially damaged. And then we did, a couple of them got out on 45% markers, and then we had a couple tear downs and a couple of buyouts, and boom, boom, we're done. And
Can I suggest that be a sidebar that we call out in this report?
Sure.
Because for legislators and others, they may not get that.
It's a huge
That kind of
environmental justice,
Well-
huge environmental justice.
Huge.
To be honest, that's my biggest thing about what the state role is. more than anything else in all of this conversation, SISD, substantial improvement, substantial damage, is the biggest piece of the unknown world of us playing or administering the NFIP. How would the state manage substantial damage assessments if we had another 2023 flood? We would basically be in charge of doing the assessment of the thousands of structures that were flooded. And how would we even attempt to take that on? I know that towns say the same thing, so I'm not.
Yeah.
But it's one
There are
thing for us
programs, like
to.
Oklahoma has a program for doing it. They actually have stand-up teams. I think we were trying to stand that up 12 years ago.
After Irene.
Yes.
They'll try to stand up a team where you could get called in.
Yeah.
Everyone, various people, maybe I'm trained, you're trained, and various CFMs around the state. And if there's a flood in the Mad River Valley, we just send in everybody who's on the SD team. But that's, yes, a big, it's a lot of work after a flood.
I would suggest to the state, we would need firms on retainer, large engineering firms on retainer.
Which we do have now,
Yeah.
do have.
But I don't think they're prepared for the scale that you just described though, right?
And because I'm still pretty
Yeah.
sore about this, if you remember, one of the reasons why RPC is committed to having CFMs, at least one on staff, was to help with this very kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so because they were worried about pinching freaking pennies,
Yeah.
and I don't mind saying this publicly, they didn't activate us. I mean, we went out with a couple of teams, but you had a cadre of at least probably 11 or more CFMs that could have gone out and helped. But the state, and this could have been reimbursed, but because of concerns about FEMA reimbursement,
Right.
you didn't actually harness the people in the state who've already spent money in to train to do this very kind of thing. And it was just it's like how, and so we're going to pay a consulting firm as opposed to actually using the
Yeah,
resources
we didn't know
have.
you existed, otherwise we would have asked you,
Yeah.
because we were pretty busy.
I mean, in the future state, if we do have a much larger role, has to be a state commitment, independent of FEMA reimbursement,
Exactly.
a state commitment to do it. And then
That
it's
would be
gonna be a
amazing.
combination of.
Yeah, we couldn't have done it all. We wouldn't have been sufficient either.
Yeah.
But it was still,
Takes a village.
that's a workforce of people who were kind of sitting there ready
Ready
to
to
go.
go. Yeah, no, that's tragic.
Yeah.
Sorry. to bring
Well,
that
and I
up.
think that
No, it's good to bring
discussion just brings up the point that in a large scale event like that, the work needs to be done. It's a matter of who takes responsibility for it. So the state taking it on doesn't create a unique amount of work. It just concentrates it in one place versus expecting the towns, which are already literally drowning in some cases, having to take it on at the same time. This was a huge issue with the lake floods where, we had towns who had to take on this question for, 50, 75, 100 properties all at once. And it was a huge challenge. Luckily, the geographic scope was smaller, but, I think the state would certainly have bigger resources to tap into. Like you have all the fire inspectors, you have other entities within the state that have these same skills, in addition to the RPCs and the towns and others. It doesn't create more work, it just shifts where it happens.
It does. And one of the things that we have done, so Chris and I don't know how many conversations we had trying to figure out how to get the RPCs to be able to be, at your discretion, basically be activated to help us to do SD trainings with towns. From that experience, to your point, we do have retainer contracts with 2 firms to stand up programs. Basically, the idea is that towns would say, we need help to do substantial damage. We need help to do our post-flood permitting program, like assessing documents, assessing proposals, sending out letters, whatever it might be. And we could essentially assign consultants under our contract to those towns. And we would do an MOU with those towns so that they would, because they can be eligible for those costs under FEMA, but no town has the ability to stand up a contract like that post flood. To even stand it up ahead of the time, to anticipate that they may need that kind of assistance. And our team can help in very small localized floods to do that role, but not in something like a 23 or a 24.
And part of the challenge, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But part of the challenge was we had lost so much institutional memory ahead of the 23 flooding that frankly, like even Ben Rose didn't exactly understand how the MOU with the RPCs worked. Cause he thought that, and I'm not calling out names. I mean, it's just for, he
Yeah,
thought
no,
that
100%.
MOU was only with BEM, whereas that MOU actually empowered the SEOC to have us authorized work with any agency. And so we kind of lost, and because we were so overwhelmed, we kind of lost like a week or two there as we're trying to explain, this is what that MOU does. It's not just with BEM. It's that stands in for work, bring us in to work with VTrans or ANR or Department of Health or whoever. And so that's just, I bring that up in case I get hit by a bus. It's just something else. If somebody else in the SEOC can say, no, that MOU applies, authorize the SEOC to harness our PC resources to however is needed, and that we can do.
We tried so hard. We tried so hard. There's
I mean, it
only so
didn't
much
help
effort
that-
you can put to it.
It didn't help
But-
that FEMA's whole PA reimbursement for substantial damage work was still in its, we'd never done it in Vermont. It's still relatively new to FEMA. So even FEMA wasn't good at answering the questions that we had. So it was just
Well, it's
horrible.
that and the barriers that they created were their own policies that can be changed. It wasn't statute itself that created. I mean, that's the story of FEMA, isn't it? That's the story of FEMA, is that it's their own policies that limit them from being able to do the things that they want to do, which are things that they could change and with their
Can't get out of their own way.
ability to change. Yes. But I think that substantial damage is something that we have a lot of thoughts on in our shop, following 23 and 24.
We have
I
thoughts,
think it's
we have PTSD, we have.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good point, Catherine, that it concentrates the work and how do you coordinate it. But I think it's like goes back to the charge of like what is the staff necessary or the commitments that's necessary to be able to do something on that scale. Because like if you think like we did a lot of training and support of some of the worst hit towns. Like Mike, I think you didn't do as much with Ned because you guys kind of had it in hand pretty well. He spent a ton of time in Berlin. He spent a ton of time in the small towns. Like I was basically doing Johnson's SD. I was basically doing Wolcott's SD, you know, like Lamoille County. And
Yeah,
so
I
it's
think we
like,
had Ned for about a day because we had already surveyed. We had done a preliminary because we visited 250 sites that we divided up among our staff and just hit them to go through and say, who has water in the first floor? You know, because there's certain things like this is not going to be substantially damaged. If you did not get water in your first floor, all you had water was in your basement, you're not going to be SD. So we could just go through not, just hitting through all these places till we got down to like the 16 that were left. Then we brought in Ned with the computers and the programs and said, all right, help us out with these. These are all of our borderline ones.
yeah.
And he was able to then just hit these 16 buildings and determine which ones were SD and which ones missed.
Yeah, it's like the triage that it's like us doing triage in a town where we don't live that flooded. It's like you don't necessarily, that's a conversation maybe for a different day and different topic, but that would definitely be a major thing, I think, in my mind that would need to be addressed very openly and frankly, and would have to be like a specific commitment by the state if that was part of it's part of the discussion. I guess not to go too far afield since we're already way behind on our agenda.
And speaking of that, I'm sorry, I had to arrive late and now leave early, but I'm just glad to be
Good to
part of
see
it
you.
for a while.
Thank you,
See you at the
Catherine.
next
Bye-bye.
meeting.
See you at the next one.
So we've got about an hour left, Rebecca, and
Yep.
so.
Yep. I have on here for I had updates and discussion. I think we can save a lot of time in that. It was mostly a way, like I said, I think a lot of those are things that we've discussed. FEMA did, Rob and I had anticipated, you know, that we would want to have FEMA speak to the committee. And knowing FEMA, wanted to get a request in sooner rather than later, even if it changes based on the advice or input of the committee. We put together a list of questions, which I shared and transmitted that to Chris. Chris Markusich. I'm like totally blanked on his last name. Chris Markusich heads up the FM&I branch, the Floodplain Management and Insurance branch at FEMA Region 1 in Cambridge. And we knew he'd have to route that through their own regional leadership, through headquarters leadership, how and if they could respond or not. We've gotten, not officially, but kind of more informally, a positive response that they believe that they'd be able to respond. We don't know in what capacity. Like, is it going to be written comments in response? Is it going to be someone who's actually going to be able to testify and, provide input to the committee? And if it is someone who provides input to the committee, who is it? Is it Chris or is it someone else, like a regional administrator or someone from headquarters?
They have to route the request to their general counsel, right? And of course, their general counsel is living in the world of Trump administration, right? And so that's the unknown and the uncertainty here. But just a
Smitty-
positive signal, we'll take it. I mean, if they can respond to questions in writing, that's better
We
than nothing.
get a bus and we just drive down and meet them at a bar somewhere. And it's not official. We're just gonna talk to you over a couple beers about your experience
Chris
on
would
these
be-
8 questions.
And a Faraday cage in case they're nervous.
I'm sure that Chris would actually be very amenable to that.
I know.
We'd watch a ball game, have
Chris
an
looks
informal
good.
conversation. From what Chris told me, Smitty, who's the attorney, I don't actually know what his actual name is because everyone refers to him as Smitty.
I used
That
to
he
know
actually,
that
Oh my God.
Smith is his last name, so that's where the Smitty comes from. I think it might be Scott Smith, but he's
That's
a
boring.
I don't even know what his actual name
He's
is.
a character.
Um,
When I left, he was their general counsel when I
He still
quick
is.
tangent. When I left FEMA after being 13 months there, you'll love this in the world we're living in now in terms of. Because I was coming back to a program that received FEMA funding, so my salary back as an FIP. I received, after a sit down with them about what the job was I was taking here, after leaving FEMA, a FedEx packet this thick of all the things I could and could not do for the ensuing couple of years after I left FEMA.
Fun, good times.
Yeah, I guess all that's out the window these days, but yeah, Smitty's a very thorough guy. Let's put it that way.
So he's given a positive indication. He's the one I think, and I think regional administrator had given a positive signal. I think it's just a matter of getting them to follow up and actually give an answer officially. So just want to mention that, and obviously the questions, like I said, we wanted to prepare them to get them out because knowing this would take a long time for FEMA. But if there's questions or other things to add, I think start thinking about those and we can provide them at a follow-up with FEMA once they confirm in one way or another written response or in testimony. I think
Some of
if
our
we-
questions are just like mechanical, right?
Yeah.
Like
No,
if the state takes it all over soup to nuts from towns, like instead of having all these communities and enrollees, is it just the state as under one community identification number? Yes or no? We don't think that's how it would work, and if that's not how it works, do towns still ultimately have to issue a permit? And would that just be like a cover sheet over a state permit? So we just had a lot of mechanical questions in there, but I think you guys have raised throughout this meeting so far today, other questions we could tee up for them.
But those made total, I mean, certainly at the start, made total sense
Yeah.
to me, and I'll just offer up for myself. I mean, I don't know what your all state policy would be, but if an in-person meeting with them actually helps us get more and better input as opposed to a Zoom or an email conversation, I mean, I'm up for going down, because to me, this is like core
Yeah.
answers that we really need to get. So if it because it might even expedite it, right? Like, I mean, as opposed to them having to take the time.
Yeah.
They'll maybe let us record it or something like that to kind of come back and transcribe or
Mhm.
with all the handy dandy AI tools and all that stuff. If that makes it faster and maybe more productive, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's kind of like, Rebecca, you'll let us know, but I mean, certainly that's something to offer up. If they're more comfortable speaking, if we drive down there versus them patching in. Sometimes, I mean, it used to be back in the day, they would drive up here for various meetings, to meet with VPN.
They have been much more able to travel in the past several months. They haven't been able to travel anywhere. But we're in the middle of scope of work for our next fiscal year application, even though we're already in the fiscal year. But they're like, we're prepared to travel up to see every state, like at your own place. So they have been very open and willing to travel.
Great.
But I think it's a really great point, Chris, because I think What I'm not sure is because FEMA's really, I don't know if this is unique or not. This is my only experience really, is like FEMA regions are not necessarily below headquarters. Like they don't answer to headquarters. They're their own individual entities that are equal to headquarters. On something like this, I'm not sure if they would have the region or someone from headquarters. I don't know how that's changed internally, but I think it's a good point. Chris had been out on, we just had our NFIP bi-monthly meeting last week, but Chris was out and not in the meeting, but I will follow up with him to pin him down a little more specifically to plan for either joining one of our meetings in person on Zoom or offering as a group to attend at their offices, and we could figure that out, I think.
And does it matter relative to other invited guests, like other states and things like, does it just kind of given the broader uncertainty, does it matter whether we get them invited sooner or later? Like, does it matter whether we talk to them in August or October?
Kind of foundational question.
I feel like that
I
too.
would think we'd want
I feel like
region one early,
I feel
because
like-
it may exclude other options. We might go through that. We don't even have to talk about that. Now that we know
Right.
this, that's
Yeah.
not even an option to talk
Yeah,
about.
that's kind of what I was leaning towards too, but.
It's a great point. I agree. I think that, ultimately, because it's about participation in their program, we need to have some understanding of how those things, what are the options that are available to us to really even consider if it's about participation in their program.
And they might also be able to advise, not like any kind of like clandestine stuff, but like what are they seeing that may be in the offing? Because right oftentimes you'll be with a federal agency, it's like, this is the answer now, but be aware
Yeah.
that headquarters, they're proposing these changes. So before you commit to doing this, you may want to pause, just,
Yeah.
I mean, you have that with federal agencies all the time. And so that could be another, really good reason to kind of talk to them, just in case they're able to kind of share what's coming up. I'm not asking them to look into a crystal ball, but like actual
Yeah.
stuff they can share about
Yeah.
what's coming. There's always something coming.
So I will follow up with Chris to try to start to pin him down. I will maybe put him on the spot of offering up the August agenda, of having him join him or someone else from the region or from FEMA to join us for August, which seems really soon, but that will at least get the
21st of
conversation
July.
going.
My brain hasn't still registered that reason.
Yep.
Already
Um,
approaching.
the-
August.
Oops, sorry.
No, never mind. Just, I'm mumbling to myself. It's that time of day.
I get it.
Sorry.
So next on updates, I wanted to just raise this. I don't think we have to have a huge discussion on it, but I just wanted to raise it to the awareness of the other members of the committee. ASFPM just released maybe about a month or two ago their 2025 state and territory floodplain management assessment. So we've had some conversation about what other states do and challenges other states have and what our other state programs look like. This is a really good, with the caveat, it's very big, but this is a good, if you're trying to get a sense of some of the different challenges and ways this program is administered in different states, this can be a really good insight into that. I have a link on the agenda to the report. So I think they had almost every state. I don't know if they got all states and most of the territories, but not all territories. And it's like this ridiculously long questionnaire. It's like 150, 170 something questions. It took me like multiple days to finish. And it asks all sorts of questions like, where do you get your authorization from? How do you do funding? Are you in your emergency management? Are you natural resource? Like where are you housed? How do you do your work? Do you have state permits? Do you have, like how do you interact with your towns? So, and then they also look at those changes over time because they've done this assessment at least in 2017 and 2025. I think they may have done it one time earlier than that as well. I think this might have been the third time they've run this. So they're tracking changes of states as well as what is the current state. So that could be helpful to help provide insight to people if you're trying to understand some of the issues that and how states administer this program. So that, and then the last piece, I think just make a mention. I don't think we need to go that far into it because I think we've discussed this in different times over the past, like in the February meeting and in our conversations, FEMA's review council report and findings. I put that as a placeholder. Chris, you raised this of like, what is FEMA going to do? And I think just as Catherine made the comment in our discussion of like, we just have to, I think, continue under the current assumption of what we know in the world that we know it is going to be. And things may change. And from that, we may have to respond or react. But I don't think we can try to create every contingency for things that we don't know. But I did put a link to FEMA's review council report and the slides from their presentation that was held in, when was it? I'm like, I don't even, it all blends together now. I think that was in May. And ASFPM, Association of State Floodplain Managers, is a nonprofit entity that kind of is a proponent for floodplain management. And I linked to some of the commentary on the FEMA Review Council report, if it was a helpful insight into some of the, because it's very much like inside baseball. Some of it's like very into the weeds, and then some of it's like huge, broad, 10,000 foot view. So I thought that the ASFPM commentary could be helpful to provide some insight on some of the details and discussions that were at play and some of the background on that.
This could be another brief sidebar in the report, but one of the things we may want to mention from the council is I keep seeing this, basically the quadrupling of the threshold, the disaster declaration threshold from 1 million to 4. And for us, that's huge, right? Because a lot of our towns, I mean, I hear all the time, like, we won't replace that culvert, FEMA will pay for it next to the flood we have. And we got to kind of move them off of that because $4 million for a lot of our towns, it would be huge. And that also is going to impact our HMGP. I mean, it's like assuming they start awarding HMGP again, that's going to decrease that funding as well. And so we should probably just do that may be one of those, again, we need to stick with what the reality is, but just kind of say, by the way, all trend, because even under the Obama administration, they were looking at increasing those thresholds. I mean, everybody's been wanting to do it. Now the dam is kind of broken, right? And you're not going to probably push that back.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of bipartisan support for increasing those thresholds.
Yeah.
So that's something I think we could put in there, like just so even on, I know it doesn't necessarily affect NFIP as much, except for that's going to be probably less buyout money that we're going to have access to.
If only someone has written a commentary about how towns need to proactively be planning and creating capital to plan for changes in PA. I say that jokingly because Chris wrote
monthly, right?
Chris wrote a really good piece.
It is a harsh fiscal reality, though.
Yeah.
And Northeast Kingdom was kind of learning it, right? And the state kind of threw some money at them this year, but
Yes.
I mean, but a picture but that was a pretty cheap one.
Oh,
And
yeah.
You can't get your PA, you can't get your public assistance. So forget about the insurance side, you can't get your PA, your declaration. You can't get your declaration, you're fixing all yourself, so.
Yeah, it's.
Carrie just asked for a link for Chris's commentary. I think I'm like, we can provide that. We'll find it.
Period. If we forget, it's just, if you Google Vermont Digger Campany, you'll see all of my screeds.
They're all good, Chris. They're all good.
Here it is. I found it.
Thank you, Chris.
I'll put it in the chat.
It's that kind of overlap of climate changes here, all the fallout from it in terms of these severe storms, coupled with the Treasury just being more and more in the red with every passing year. I just don't see how we revert back to the good old days.
Yeah, and I mean, I look at the kingdom. I mean, someone had mentioned the kingdom learning. Chris, I think you mentioned it, like with Sutton kind of getting their declaration, and it's just like, I feel like so many places in the kingdom, they have such small towns, and trying to just do basic maintenance on their existing structures, they're trying to kind of like, they're working really hard to try to patch things together to keep them up and running. So what is the contingency of upsizing bridges and culverts and road and infrastructure outside of declarations and outside of disasters, just in general, that pre-disaster mitigation? And then how do you recover? It's big. It's big. And I think, the state is already not in our house because that's not our bailiwick, but like VEM, it's already very much like, how do we prepare for that? Especially considering that it was like a change overnight without really building the systems that are needed to be in place to do something like that, of some sort of state public assistance, essentially. And what does it look like and how does it work? So I think it's a good topic to bring up and to mention. I think just to touch on it, but maybe not necessarily like a focus of this report, obviously. But obviously, there's just so many unknowns with FEMA. So
Yeah, it just seems like there's some for the reader.
Yeah.
Legislature and anybody else that might want to pick it up. It's like, how do you put this report and its recommendations in context of all the broader stuff that we've been bringing up, right? Because of that interrelatedness.
Because maybe that is a chapter, is actually like the relationship of buyouts in Vermont to individual assistance and federal funding and disaster declaration, just kind of weaving that together and just kind of like, we're so reliant on what has been.
Yeah.
Now we're beginning to get glimpses into what the future is going to look like. Hence the need for, like, we're focused like on the NFIP conversation, a lot of stuff around insurance, but then which means you're going to need even more people really going to need insurance because you're likely not to get have access to as much federal aid.
Mm-hmm.
But the other piece of this again is a life safety one, to remember that, again, stop the stabbing.
Mm-hmm.
We're to Mike's point, we already have a lot of exposure. So part of the whole logic behind the Flood Safety Act was stop increasing that risk.
We have a hard enough time with our existing risk. We can't add more. So that,
Because it always makes me nervous, right? I respect the governor's and other legislators' opinion where they're talking about going back to the river corridor and others, right? They talk about, well, this is going to impact the availability of housing. It's like, okay, but realistically, all right, it's like how much, if you're going to make these kinds of public investments and private investments, why do you want to put it at a known risk when we know that even if we were carbon neutral tomorrow, there's already enough gunk in the atmosphere, things are going to keep getting worse for decades or centuries. So we're at the beginning of this, not the end. Therefore, that's why this is all, it's kind of a reminder, this is why we're talking about all this in the first place. And while I'm kind of writing this in my head.
Well, it almost strikes me as like the report might intentionally, it gets into the weeds on stuff, but periodically zoom out for the reader and kind of bring it back into focus, at a higher level. And because it's going to necessarily get very detailed.
Yeah, which is why I said the state would benefit the state greatly in their big picture to have a land use map that would really go through and say what areas are what, because some floodplains, as we said, some floodplains, you can build in a floodplain if you build the code. And there's some places where you should not build in that floodplain. It just
Even
depends
if
if at 100-year floodplain, you go 1 inch of water.
Right.
And it's
Versus
like
9 feet.
it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense over there. But if you're in a built out municipality like Montpelier, and you go through and say, yeah, but I could take this empty lot here, I just need to go and put it 2 feet. And as I said, since 1973, we built 5 new buildings. None of them flooded. You can build flood-proof buildings.
And there's places there is places we all agree where that is floodplain, but given the slow velocities, shallow depths, you can build safely in that part of the floodplain. But there are other places, they are not, as you said, it's not.
We do a lot of this.
Unequal.
We look at a road like Route 2, you got the left and right side of the road, and you're like, the left side of the road is the river side of the road.
Mm-hmm.
Like, buy out those houses,
Mhm.
elevate those houses. It's not like every floodplain needs to be cleared of every structure.
right.
And it's like, no, if there's an empty building lot on the right-hand side, you can build there. But based on
Build
this
it
one
right.
here in Montpelier's,
Yeah.
you know, 2 foot of freeboard gets you above the 500-year floodplain. So
Yeah.
you're getting into a much lower risk area.
sure.
And now that you can't just throw 2 feet across everywhere in the state.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't throw 2 feet at the village of Johnson,
Mhm.
because village of Johnson, you put 2 feet in, it just means you have that much less water in your house.
Right.
But other places, you know, you've got to really figure it out what it's gonna be and then put out a map that says, you know, that way after the event, we're not sitting here figuring out who are we gonna approve for buyouts?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna look at the map. You're in the buyout area, you're in that area.
And this right here, to me, from as far as like Act 181 implementation at the regional scale, is the tragedy of what happened with all the tier 3 road rule stuff. Because the conversations I wanted to have with our towns was
Yeah.
exactly that. Like,
Yeah.
how do we, because of our 31 villages, you know, are compact settlements, only 6 don't have significant flood or fluvial erosion risk, and at least part of them.
Huh. Interesting.
And so that's the conversation I wanted to have, was like, so let's talk about your growth, potential for growth,
Yeah.
both within your existing kind of footprint, but also can we start talking about how do you evolve up and away?
Yeah.
What are some adjacent or nearby areas that would be suitable for housing?
And you
And
brought
also-
Jamaica and the infill exercise as an example of that, where.
Yeah, we did this, we did Weston and others,
Yeah.
and then we did that whole guide this past spring, which I think I shared with everyone.
Yeah, it's great.
And, but that's the conversation I wanted to have.
You
But
could-
instead, it was all explaining, no, we're not doing tier 3 and road rules. So my hope is that after some time has passed, we can go back and kind of like for next iteration of the plan is like drill down a little deeper. And, ideally like maybe retain some landscape architects or others and just kind of say, and do like visualization of here's what it would look like to evolve up and away. Here's how many housing units you could reasonably have here.
Yeah.
Here would be a good, like, if you want to move the flooding town office up to, like, you don't need to tear it down, but just think about, where's it records repository or something like that, anyway.
Don't put them in the
Don't
basement.
mean to go too deep, but but that to me is where to Mike's point,
Yeah.
like that was kind of the lost opportunity.
I'm gonna break in here just to redirect us, I think, back to because we only have about half an hour left. And so just wanted to get through some of the last of these. I think those are all great points. And I think that is something that is selfishly helpful for the conversation around state minimum flood hazard standards. But I think it could play into the role of like the overlap of river corridor and floodplain development and the role that the state may play. Like, what is the policy? How do we look at different things? What are the types of policies that we put in place? But I wanted to bring us on to the next item on the agenda, the future meeting topics and guests. And I wanted to push us in here just because we have a list. We've talked quite a bit about what are the types of like stories and experiences that we want to hear. We've talked a little bit about who those people may be that we may want to invite in. And so I'd like to we have about half an hour left. I'm anticipating that we will not need our 5 minutes for public comment at the end, given the makeup of our meeting today. I don't know if we need to talk too much about the study report template. We spoke a little bit about the layout of the report, and I think that could be for a future topic. So I wanted to take this next half hour to really review the potential future topics, who those guests may be, when we might ask people to join us, and who might be the one who wants to take the lead on being the liaison between the committee to inviting people in. This may be too ambitious in half an hour, but I also had started a template of, I have from state programs, questions we might ask other states about their permitting program. But then I kind of created a start to a template of general guest questions. And if that's not helpful, then we can abandon that. But I think what we want to do, though, as we invite people into the committee, we want to be able to provide something to our invited guests to give them a framework. Like, what are we going to be asking you? What do we want you to speak on? And it doesn't have to be like 30 questions. It could just be like 2 or 3 guiding statements. So I wanted to touch on that and whether or not we can at the next meeting, maybe or if we don't have enough time now, like, do we want to work on that as an actual document in working session? Is it something where each person who maybe invites a certain person on a topic can work on and then bring back to the committee for input? So
And the
that's
question-
ambitious for half an hour.
Question set for invited guests, there'll probably be some common questions we want to ask all of them, but I think depending on the guests, we could have different questions, right? If we invite, our state insurance folks in, we're gonna probably have different questions for them than floodplain management questions for the state of Kentucky, right? So I feel like that once we get our list of kind of guests that we want, that will bring the needed perspective, then for each guest, we can probably tailor the question set for them. Do we have in writing, or maybe we can just kind of sketch it on the fly? I mean, we've talked already through this meeting about certain guests, and even last meeting, certain guests. I mean, I think FEMA for sure, right? Colleagues from Department of Financial Regulation, state insurance. Somebody last time mentioned VLCT.
Yeah, I have
Okay.
what I shared in our agenda. And this is what I have I should be sharing now. Hopefully you can all see it. Is
Yeah,
like
I'll make
future
a
topics
picture.
to consider. From that, I kind of put some of the themes of things we had discussed in the first and second meetings, but I feel like maybe this could be the document that we can mark up and then share around after the meeting's over. So we have kind of, and how we want to order it. So we have August, September, October, November, December. We have 5 meetings.
And do we have potentially like multiple guests at a meeting? Like if we have a 3-hour meeting, do we have 2 guests at that meeting? Bundle them up if we can.
Can I ask a context question? Just, in our region, I just think about local papers. I seldom do I ever read about like zoning enforcement and legal challenges. So I don't have great visibility into, like how often that happens. And maybe it's not happening. I mean, obviously like the Daniel Bonnier case, and there are a few others like that makes the
His city perhaps, but
yeah, but I just don't, but I don't know if they're, and maybe they're happening, maybe they're not, but I'm assuming, is VLCT generally the insurer that's going to cover legal defense costs for like errors and omissions and, because this is a question I've asked also in the zoning appeal. And in the, in the permitting appeal discussion that ACCD is leading, because where I was wondering because part of the question I was curious about for VLCT is, and they may not be able to get into specific cases, but like, what are they seeing anything related to floods? Related to towns, not only related like to, because they're not doing flood insurance unless they're brokering maybe private insurance in cases. But I don't know, I guess the open-ended question is, are you seeing it impact insurance policies or other risk and liability exposures related to town administration and just doing business? And the answer maybe there's none. And there probably is going to be an answer, because I just don't hear about it.
Yeah.
I mean, in my world, I've had that structures torn down, pretty frequently. And because they were built in places they couldn't be.
Yeah.
And by law in Maryland, we had to bring places into compliance. I remember a Wawa station had to cut the front off the building and bring it back in to meet the setbacks. That was not uncommon stuff. But maybe that's because I was a hard ass. I don't know.
There are some examples that Rebecca and I have from our travels of towns with NFIP compliance, with towns, pursuing enforcement. Sometimes it was because of threat of FEMA coming in and sanctioning them. I don't want to mention those towns here on the record because I'm not shaming towns, but by and large, we think that's a real gap, which is the actual enforcement. We always say, kind of in sequential fashion, easiest part's adopting the regs, the hardest part's enforcing them. on the enforcement part, the easiest part's issuing the permit. The hardest part's making sure that they followed the permit, the conditions, and built the way they said that it was going to be built.
And the big piece that's missing to avoid enforcement in the first place is education and outreach, so it doesn't happen at all. Because oftentimes it is an accident.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, Carrie has her hand up, so
Yeah.
acknowledge Carrie, and then I was going to jump in.
Right.
I appreciate you mentioning enforcement. It's for small communities, you can imagine it's really hard. Oftentimes those that are active in the local jurisdictions, whether they're an administrator, or part-time administrator, or part-time or select board member, or part-time NFIP coordinator, sometimes they're so small that there's limited, if any, enforcement. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Sometimes it's hard to enforce on your neighbor too at the local level. And so these are sort of the local realities of small communities. At some point, I imagine you all have been tracking the costs of recovery and costs of flood impacts. And that information in and of itself is important. And to put it into net present value so that we can really fully understand the breadth of the impact in today's dollars. But that's often telling in showing the kind of the fiscal impact both at the local level in terms of coming up with their portion of the non-federal match to FEMA recovery dollars, as well as overall state monies pertaining to PA. So that those costs are important. And then also to understand the impact on to get some, I don't know, some realtors there to help us better understand the tension between maybe it's the Vermont Real Estate Association. I don't know what it's called, or Home Builders Association to try to get a sense for those tensions, because they're real out there. And again, some of these small communities with limited available room for growth, it's the cheaper lands, especially in today's days, are this era, are typically the vulnerable lands. So,
And the sad irony, right, that properties that are damaged suddenly become more available, affordable housing stock because they have that history now. The prices are lower, therefore there's a real incentive for people who can least afford it, probably.
Yeah.
I look at homes for sale that I know have flooded and the prices are down in the 200 range. That any place else would be 300, 400, 500. And it's like, but that's somebody's home now, right? As long as it's okay.
I had a colleague.
yeah, and there's,
whose
if I could
daughter
interrupt,
basically fell into that category. Sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry too. But I just do want also mention that there's a tension too at the local level, and I'm sure you must know those anecdotes and could help shed some light on that. But the tension behind when is it do you actually what a town would agree to having a parcel or a structure removed when that very structure is contributing to the grand list, and maybe they can't condemn all the buildings that are partially or substantially damaged, because I understand it, at least in the floodplain, those projects that are currently in the special flood hazard area, the towns are the ones that are applying for that kind of degree of mitigation of removing structures.
And we did a white paper with Department of Taxes about the pros and cons of buyouts to that point, Carrie.
Oh, great. Getting that on.
We're trying to work with VLCT and others to try to make the case for if it's a blighted property, right, if it's uninhabitable, don't eschew the buyout because it comes off the tax rolls. Because by the way, if it's going to continue to degrade and blight a neighborhood or something, that's going to diminish the tax rolls too.
Yeah.
Work that into your decision-making calculus.
And from Chris's prompting of that question with me and our staff in discussions, we had tried to tee that up as a topic for Lake Champlain Basin Program submits topic ideas under the larger EPA TMDL funding that comes from EPA. We tried to put that out there as a discussion, as like a study topic, like for a research topic, but I don't think it got picked up. I don't think any interest came out of it, but I think because Chris, you prompted that question, and then we've raised that. We also had looked at maybe doing that as like a Vermont Silver Jackets project to see what interest we might have. Silver Jackets it's led by the Army Corps, and it brings together federal and state partners and try to do funding for projects and bring different resources together. I think your point, Carrie, if I'm understanding you right, are you thinking more, or maybe just for clarity, are you thinking more like what is the actual cost of construction in a floodplain due to having to do different types of building and development approaches because you're in a floodplain? So like flood vents, or like reconfiguring a building so the parking is on the main floor and the housing is above it, things like that? Or are you talking about like more the question of what we were talking, like Mike was bringing up before, of where are the places that are more appropriate or could accommodate floodplain development versus places that might not? What are you thinking, like from the realtors or home builder input, that you really would want to try to drill down on?
That's a good follow-up question. Well, I've heard in the past developers have said, "Oh, we'll assume the risk of building in these vulnerable areas," and yet we all know the full impact of those kinds of externalities aren't typically just borne by that property owner, or the person who buys that property. So it's really, I think, there's probably a set of questions, but
Okay.
having a better understanding of that tension, you're right. I don't know if we fully articulate or quantify the actual impacts necessary if a compliant piece of property is not in the floodway, but in the special flood hazard area, and that town is only regulating special flood hazard area. What are the costs that would obviously be passed on to the home buyer, or perhaps even the renter?
One of the things that I can share, I don't know how helpful it would in like priming this question, Carrie. We were talking about this a little bit for state minimum flood hazard standards, in consideration of like what is some of that increased cost of constructing a building in a floodplain that would be compliant. When ASCE was updating the building code, the flood code in 24, they had provided some literature review and studies that looked at like what is the actual increased cost for constructing in floodplains. So I could pass that on again, just as like maybe a way of helping to prime some of it, some kind of teeing up some questions. One of the things I wanted to mention on that front is maybe real estate disclosure. Again, I don't want to get too far afield of the actual topics at hand, but in 2023, in the 2024 session, there was also the passage of the real estate disclosure, and then was amended last session, not the session that just ended, but in 25. And so, does that play a role or a consideration in terms of like that idea of like passing housing on, like it's only been in effect in Vermont for 2 years, but have we seen anything that's come from that? Maybe teeing that up, that transfer of risk, to the next owner, or knowledge of risk and transfer of risk. I'm like, we have a page on our website that has some information about real estate disclosure, but we can pass that link on. But maybe teeing up the 4 questions are in that idea. But I think the idea of realtors and home builders is a good consideration. Again, it's like you don't want to, it's like hard because this topic can encompass everything or very small, like how do we kind of stay on the topic, and what are the questions that we want to ask related to the charge of the committee? Where is it?
But there's some, I think some good, I think it's always helpful if the folks that we're hearing from are from a broad
Yes.
perspective.
Yeah,
especially if
exactly.
something like this will have an impact in what they do.
Yeah, and we do have a pretty good relationship with Realtor, mainly through Sea Grant. So Sea Grant has been running realtor trainings for over a decade,
Oh, yeah.
um, for like a decade and a half at least. And we've been doing like NFIP realtor trainings through them around the state. And so I think we could probably be able to make some connections with the Vermont Realtors Association to ask some of those questions. Um, So I added here like legal perspective and risk. This was a topic I think kind of Chris had commented on at one point. Like I added DFR here, Division of Financial Regulation, kind of like role and state of private flood. The role of private flood in Vermont.
Is that where the department, is that where insurance is?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should-
So I can assign this to us. I'm gonna start putting names next to things. I'm like, who wants to do this?
Rebecca, if you or Rob are on LinkedIn, I think I reposted about what was going on in Hardwick. I'll see if I can find it, but anyway, because we want to kind of see how that
My
conversation.
account's been asleep just because I was tired of getting emails. So like I said, I can wake it back up again now really easily. I just need to log back in, but yeah.
I am on there. I'm not on there that often, but I know Kristen has told us that she's been trying to be very active on there to promote a lot of the work that they've been doing, to share their stories with professionals, not just in Vermont, but outside of the state too, to try to, I think, kind of solicit interest from outside.
It was
Kristen's
the,
also running a whole series of talks coming up.
It was the Atkins Neighborhood Conversation. Kristen Leahy
Yep.
posted this.
Sounds right. Yeah, knowing how active she is.
Well, and Tessa, I mean, you've worked with Kristen a lot on some of the outreach and trainings that Kristen's been running. I'm not sure if you've been part of the new series that she's trying to.
No, I haven't been a part of this one, but I just got it all emailed to me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, because we're at 3:17, just watching time, one of the things that we've talked quite a bit about is the story of towns, of municipalities, small towns, large towns. Like we have Carrie as a representative of a small community. We have Mike as a representative of Montpelier, and bigger one of our bigger communities, but also like a CRS community, has been doing substantial amount of work around floodplain management. So it's like, who might be some of the towns to come in and speak? Who might we ask to come in? What are the questions we ask? I mean, I think we have some idea of what they may say, but also like, what's the geographical range, the size range, with zoning, without zoning. VAPTA has one of the things I love that you have on your page with the annual report, Chris, is like where you have the report of like who has flood hazard bylaws, who has zoning, like all these overlays of kind of like that speaks to capacity of towns. And I think to your point, Carrie, about people from different parts of different sectors, it's like I feel like there's a tension or there's a story there about the call of the lack of capacity of small towns and the call to create more regional governance or role of regions to try to provide some of the professionalization of some of these different, I mean, not just floodplain management, but like emergency management, about like running municipalities, all this. And then I feel like there's a real big tension right now about just leave it to us to do, put everything back to the towns. Like the state shouldn't have a role in it, the county, there shouldn't be a county government role. And I feel like there is a real tension of that. And I don't know if that's just been really brought to the forefront most recently with Act 181 discussions. I feel like there's always been some tension of that in different parts of the state. But who are the towns that we may want to speak to? You know, who are the other representatives to help tell some of these different stories? Is that something like VAPTA? Maybe the question goes to VAPTA and we can put the question to the
Sure.
different regions.
Yeah, we could, we have, and we also have our annual directors retreat coming up. That may be something we could add to the agenda. We would just need text, but that's coming up in September. We need to frame the question pretty fast.
Yeah, I think large municipalities with large flood risks. I mean, the one that jumps out for me is, other than Montpelier, would be Brattleboro. I
Mhm.
think.
And Bennington. Bennington would be another good one.
Yeah. Is
Barry City.
Is Brian Bannon still,
Yep.
yeah, he's been around a while,
He's great.
in Brattleboro, so.
Yeah, I was just trying geographically kind of think of.
Yeah, that's kind of we want to kind of cover things from geographical representation and then size of community, and it's always nice that all sides of the community, if somebody's been around long enough to like have lived through
Lived
the
through a flood or
challenges.
two.
Yeah, and the challenges of permitting and.
Yeah, 'cause I know they're also a CRS community, so
That's
that would be
right.
another good one that's where I would probably lean to if you want to bring in a second larger municipality.
Yeah.
They answered the
And
wrong question.
Bennington's another good example, maybe.
It carries. Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, Bennington may be a good example as well
Yeah.
for a larger town. Barry.
Sorry, I answered the wrong question, or I heard in my head the wrong question.
I mean, I think the other piece of the story, I said it a little earlier, is that we have the examples of the big towns that have professional paid staff that are kind of, they have their ideas on it, but it's one more thing in all the things that they do. And we have the towns that don't have zoning, don't have a local hazard mitigation plan, may not have municipal plans, who are struggling. That's kind of like the two very different ends of the spectrum. But I think we also want to make sure that we're covering what is that middle range? You know, what is that average? What is that 2,000 to 3,000 person town? Not to use like a number to represent what a town is or isn't, but just trying to think of like, what is that average experience? What is Randolph? You know, how does Randolph do it? How does, like Rutland Town do this?
But I think like Michael's experience and Brian and others, if you show like how efficacious that is in a large town setting, if you had somebody like a human being with similar skill set at the RPC or something who could do this for towns, I think the larger towns can kind of show this is what it could look like.
Yeah.
These are the benefits of having professional staff in these towns of, Brattleboro is 12,000 people. So therefore, if you think about, we have a lot of 1,000-person towns, so theoretically for 12 other towns, you could have a person who could potentially provide that service at that same level, that same skill set, more efficaciously administer the program. But also, again, not just administer the thing, but I want to go back to also the education and outreach, both around what are the risks anyway? How do you mitigate your risks? But also, how do you stay in compliance with the flood hazard, so you don't get into the violation?
I mean, one of the things that I've also been really keyed into, I've gone back and forth on this in all these years, is that like the state can help to concentrate these activities and have paid professional trained staff to do these things. The RPCs can have that. But I've really come to wholeheartedly believe this and double down on this, is that there needs to be a role of the town and the buy-in of the town, especially in the NFIP. I mean, river corridors, we've had some of these discussions around difficulty of doing that, especially in small towns, but in an NFIP situation, like, what is that expectation of town buy-in, even in those really tiny towns? And, I think it's easy for everyone to just say the state should just do it. It's a lot easier that way. But I think there needs to be, like, what is that play-in of the town? Like, what does the town want to reflect in how their community does or doesn't develop, and where they do or don't limit what development happens. And to be honest, like the state could never do it. It could never be as knowledgeable about what the town wants. It's the town themselves. It's the town. It's their own place. And, what is that tension and balance of how the town still remains centered in some part of that? So if the state is doing the permitting program on their behalf, how does the town still be part of that? And that's a question I really have no good answer to. I have some ideas, but do some of our really rural and remote towns buy into that or not? I don't know. And maybe I'm being pie in the sky, but I'm like, I feel like it really needs to have some level of partnership. But I think what I want to focus on is not just cutting them out of the process, but how do we relieve some of the burden of it? But you're also going to probably face towns that don't have municipal plans, that don't have local hazard mitigation plans, that don't have zoning, do so somewhat intentionally. And so how do you balance a regulatory zoning program, with that kind of mindset of a town that you might be going into?
I get what you're saying, but what I'm increasingly thinking about is, in my perfect world, we'd almost like create a moratorium on continuing to do town plans where nothing's changed in the last 50 years. So that you take all that, harness all that volunteer energy and put it towards implementation. Because towns can take positions on things, but they don't have the capacity to actually realize their vision. What are we doing? I mean, it's good to have the conversation, but right, we invest all this time and effort into this. And I've never seen an enabling statute as complex as Vermont's. I mean, and frankly, a lot of it's not relevant to the towns whatsoever. So what if we actually empower towns to plan around what they really need to affect, which in a lot of cases is flood adaptation and resilience, and then empower them to execute on that. And it may be a culvert, or it may be something really simple and small, but how do we empower them to actually then, so you harness that volunteer capacity to affect change, as opposed to just planning and planning and planning and planning. Because
That's why we pushed so hard. We wanted to get the 10-year municipal plan.
Yeah.
So that way we could actually get some time to do some implementation. By the time we do that, we do the zoning update, we're already back to the plan update again. We haven't had any time to do anything else other than,
That's tragic. Yeah.
so.
But by my estimate, I mean, including the Wyndham Regional Commissioners, the town appointed commissioners, we probably have at least 170 volunteer planners in our region. I mean, right, if you take into account all the town planning commissions and the Wyndham Regional Commission, imagine if you could harness that 170 people
Human power.
to direct that towards actual project identification and implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it requires those local champions to move things through.
Yeah.
It doesn't get done.
And get them off the hamster wheel of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I guess the other concern that comes up with the state, which is a little bit of what was being mentioned, was once it goes to the state, it can end up being better. It could end up being making everything mushy in the middle. You don't always end up with better when it gets brought up to the state level.
You don't necessarily
It's like,
optimize.
wait, we could be better. We could do it this way. Why does the state do it this way? Well, because we've got to do it statewide, and this is what's kind of, you're like, well,
Yeah.
this
Is it
not,
better or different?
it's just, so,
No, that's absolutely. And that's why I keep thinking like the next one that's down below there, the role of county regional governance. It's not necessarily regional governance, but is there like a delegation function or something like that?
Yeah.
Where maybe it is still under the offices of the state sets the standards,
Yeah.
but then there's it's more of an intermunicipal agreement, intermunicipal collaboration supporting the effort to implement. Maybe it is, and then I've actually come around more to these kind of, for those who like the bigger communities, like Montpelier, you wouldn't necessarily need this, but the standardization of the flood hazard bylaws, everybody has the same thing, or something similar, or however that works. But then make it easier for towns to pitch in to have that single professional administrator and then you also could create a synergy among a larger population and make people aware of flood risks, flood insurance, how to access flood insurance, how to comport with it, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So again, pointing back to like, the you know, like Michael and other professionals doing this, what are the benefits of, that way you guys don't have to bear the full burden. The costs could be borne by the municipalities, but spread across,
Yeah.
several. And so that may be a model that we look at. But it's still maybe under the auspices of the state kind of streamlining things, providing technical assistance to, and whether it's the regional commissions or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You provide the technical assistance, but then we harness what we've already got, the structures, relationships, everything we already have, as opposed to creating yet another new thing. And
Well,
maybe it wouldn't work, but
And I think that goes back to Rebecca's wish, is that there just maintains some local. So what I'm looking for.
Local, local control and buy-in.
Investment and
Yeah.
control and buy-in and ownership of trying to deal with the complex set of issues that each town is dealing with, yeah.
It's gonna be different. I mean, I remember living in Belvedere, 230 people.
Yeah.
But really, there were very, very few buildings in the floodplains.
Mhm.
So actually enforcing regulations there was quite easy because it was just, the best thing they could have done would be to have a rule that says you just can't build in there.
Yeah.
Because you're not there right now.
Yeah.
Nobody-
Keep it that way.
Let's keep it that way.
Yeah.
There's plenty of land for you guys to build somewhere else.
Yeah.
We're a big town with no people, pick somewhere else. But yeah, then you've got other places that are completely different. It's like everybody lives in the floodplain, right?
I know there's one other group that maybe is not here that should be, or not. I'm just throwing this out. I'm wondering if either state treasurer and or Michael Gahn from the Vermont Bond Bank, I've been curious about NFIP in relationship to bond ratings. And again, I Google AI, write somebody's home, the lights just dimmed in Iowa because I asked this question. But, it says a strong NFIP ensures property values remain protected, defaults are minimized, preserving a city's high bond rating. Now, they're talking about places with significant flood risk exposure. There may be no correlation in Vermont whatsoever, because maybe we're too diffuse. But it might be, if you guys don't mind just throwing the question to PCHAC or to Michael Gahn, like, are you seeing this in Vermont's bond ratings or municipal bond ratings about being in the NFIP or not, or like in the meeting you're having nationally or whatever?
Yeah.
Is this something on the horizon? Because then that gets to the cost, the other cost of being in it or not being in it, related to your ability to borrow and your bond rating. And again, we may be too small a scale,
But it's worth that.
but it's worth an email.
Yeah.
We've got the state bond bank, so we're not really municipal, doesn't affect the Montpelier's municipal bond rating because we don't have one. Because we're in the state, so it'd be interesting.
Yeah.
We are at time. We're actually over time, 3:33. What I would like to do with the folks who remain, we still have a quorum, is I think maybe we'll try to prioritize for August meeting, getting FEMA to speak. And the other thought is to share those questions with the other state permitting programs. I have a bunch that are up here. So what I'm thinking is I could send like our questionnaire maybe to all of those the folks who are my counterparts in those states, and maybe see if there's one or two that might be able to come to speak to the group.
Great. Your questions made sense to me.
Yeah, agreed.
What's that?
Your questions that you sent around made sense to me.
And
Okay.
Rebecca, of that grouping of states, I mean, are there a couple of states that stand out in terms of the structure of their state program, in terms of like, would you say, oh gee, I think, Kentucky and North Dakota are the two. If I could have, if I could only have two come and talk to us, it would be these two states. I'm just curious if you have a sense.
Kentucky's really interesting to me because their the nature of,
Topography,
like, southeast Kentucky looks a lot like Vermont.
Virginia, yeah.
And they have a
Michigan's
lot of
high
similar
water
challenges
table.
to us. They have a lot of very similar challenges to us in Kentucky. They basically issue a state floodplain permit, just like their towns do. And then their towns, I think, go and issue their own permit as well. New Jersey just changed their state law. It is very comprehensive, very protective, like very climate change forward. Chris pointed out they also have coastal issues, but it's the same with Michigan. Michigan has a pretty comprehensive statewide permit, not on every single thing, but on most things. They have coastal issues and they have riverine issues. They're very flat. So a little different than us. But I'd say probably North Dakota, they're not a super active NFIP state. In my experience, Minnesota is, but I don't know how comprehensive Minnesota's program is. But that's where we can maybe send out that questionnaire, and from the answers we get, it might help to focus who we invite. If I was to pick 2 or 3, I would pick from Michigan, New Jersey, and Kentucky. But
Kentucky
maybe
has a
those
similar
answers.
social justice dynamic to low-income homes and creek bottoms and relatively poor communities. It's a very similar, I mean, yeah.
Great.
There's also some connection. Tessa and Ned had been part of Safer Apps effort, which was between UVM and some areas in Pennsylvania. So
I
And
shut
so-
my laptop. Sorry, Rebecca.
it's okay. But so we have some connections too, I think, to some work going on within the Appalachians. So I'll move forward on those, on sending that kind of questionnaire out and trying to pin down Region 1 for our August meeting. So I'll aim as these as priorities. So with that being 3:36, what I will do, I ask anyone before we break up, we talked about the report template. I think we can skip that for now. Public comment? Tessa, do you have any comments?
No, just
Okay.
a lot of notes.
Okay. So that's our next steps, I think, is to build out our August agenda. Topics that you'd like to try to address. If there's ideas of people that you'd like to come to speak about certain things, or something that you want to take on, as to like, I will ask these folks to do this. Chris, I might ask you maybe to bring DeVapta to the directors meeting of like, who from your region would you think would be a good representative to speak to this group for whatever reason? Because I think the next.
The other thing I could just take to it is what are just kind of initial thoughts on role of RPCs in like intermunicipal cooperation on floodplain administration, like in partnership with the state or a partnership. Just I could at least just kind of get some initial thoughts on that.
That'd be wonderful. That'd be great. So I think that like I see that as potentially like a September meeting, unless scheduling makes us have to kind of juggle things around. But I think a September meeting could be really good at having that municipal perspective, challenges, like hearing challenges, representation from VAPTA and other partners. So with that, do I have a motion to adjourn? I don't know if we need a motion to adjourn. Do I have a motion? We adjourned.
We are
Hearing
no objections.
Hearing no objections, I will consider us adjourned. I want to thank you all again for sticking in it,
And coming back.
showing up again, coming back, and as always, the great discussion, all the great thoughts and effort.
All right. Thank you.
I'll see you all later.
Yeah.
Bye.
See ya.